Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time I noticed the film had rewound itself, I blamed the old equipment. The Orpheum's projection booth still ran a hybrid system, digital for the new releases, but the owner insisted on keeping the vintage 35mm projectors operational for their monthly classics series. Authenticity, he called it. Character. I called it a pain in the ass, especially when the reels developed what seemed like a mind of their own. It was a Tuesday in October when everything shifted from quirky to wrong. The afternoon screening had just ended, and I'd marked the third reel of The Third Man at precisely 17 minutes and 43 seconds. A splice I'd repaired earlier that needed checking after each run. I stepped out for maybe 3 minutes to grab coffee from the concession stand. When I returned, the reel sat at 12 minutes and 9 seconds. Not random. That exact spot marked the entrance of Harry Lime's shadow on the wall, that famous reveal everyone remembers. I checked the booth's lock. Still secure. The only other key belonged to the owner, who was in Baton Rouge for the week. The projection booth at the Orpheum wasn't just locked. It was essentially a vault, converted from the theater's original strong room when they'd renovated the Art Deco palace in the 90s. One way in, one way out, through a reinforced door that required both a key and a code. The digital projector's log showed nothing unusual. The film counter on the 35mm hadn't been touched. I'd learned to photograph it before leaving after the third time this happened. Yet there it was, wound back to that precise moment where the shadows first suggest something lurking beneath Vienna's streets. That's when I saw her for the first time. Not directly, but caught in the reflection of the booth's observation window. A pale dress, almost luminescent against the dark theater beyond. The fabric seemed to belong to another era, flowing in a way modern materials don't quite manage. But when I spun around, the booth remained empty except for me and the mechanical clicking of the cooling projector. I told myself it was a reflection from the screen below, maybe a bit of light bouncing off the lobby's chandelier through the porthole window. The Orpheum was full of architectural quirks that played with light and shadow. The whole building was designed in 1928 by an architect obsessed with optical illusions and forced perspective. The lobby ceiling appeared to dome upward infinitely, and the main theater's walls contained hidden alcoves that created acoustic pockets where whispers carried across the entire space. But reflections don't choose what frame to return to. Reflections don't have preferences. The following Tuesday I experimented. Instead of The Third Man, I loaded Vertigo. Seemed appropriate given my growing sense of disorientation. This time, I marked 3 different spots across 2 reels, and documented everything with my phone, timestamps, photos, even a video of me leaving the booth. I made sure to walk all the way down to the lobby, even chatted with the girl at concessions about the weird humidity that seemed to cling to everything in New Orleans that October. 12 minutes later, I returned to find all 3 reels adjusted. Not rewound this time, advanced. Each one had moved to moments of revelation. Madeline's first appearance at Ernie's, the portrait at the museum, the bell tower sequence. Someone, or something, had edited the film into a highlight reel of obsession. The reflection appeared again as I stood there trying to process what I was seeing. Clearer this time in the booth's glass. The dress was definitely from the 20s or 30s, beaded in a pattern that caught light that didn't exist in the booth. I could make out hands now, delicate and pale, moving in graceful gestures like she was conducting an orchestra only she could hear. But the face remained a blur, a suggestion of features that wouldn't quite resolve no matter how I shifted my focus. I started leaving the booth less frequently, brought a thermos of coffee, packed sandwiches, even installed a small refrigerator in the corner. The owner praised my dedication. The other employees joked I was becoming part of the architecture, another ghost in New Orleans' most haunted theater. They didn't know about the films moving, about the reflection. I'd tried mentioning it once, casually, to the assistant manager. She'd laughed, told me the Orpheum had been playing tricks on projectionists since before talkies. Part of its charm, she said. The building had personality. But buildings with personality don't lock their doors from the inside. It happened first on a Tuesday in November, during a late screening of Sunset Boulevard. I decided to leave right after starting the last reel. Let it run out while I got a head start on closing duties. The fire door wouldn't budge. Not stuck, not jammed, locked. The handle turned freely, but the door remained sealed as if welded to its frame. The emergency release did nothing. My keycard for the electronic backup wouldn't register. Panic rose in my throat like bile, but I forced it down. Old building, old problems. I'd wait for the reel to end, try again. But as Norma Desmond descended her staircase for her close-up, the security light in the corner began to pulse. Not its usual steady blink that indicated the system was armed, but a rhythm that matched the film's score note for note. The light dimmed and brightened with Max's organ playing, creating shadows that danced across the booth's walls in patterns that shouldn't have been possible from a single light source. When the credits rolled, the door opened with a soft click, as if it had never been locked at all. I started keeping a log after that. Every anomaly, every impossible moment, documented with obsessive detail. The projection booth became my research lab, and the haunting, if that's what it was, my subject. Patterns emerged. It only happened with certain films, always classics, always ones that dealt with obsession, delusion, or the blurred line between reality and madness. The woman in the reflection appeared exclusively on Tuesdays, growing clearer each time but never quite forming a complete image. The other employees stopped joking about my dedication. Now they whispered concerns about my health, my state of mind. I'd lost weight, they said. My eyes had developed a constant darting quality, always checking reflections, always watching for movement that shouldn't be there. The assistant manager suggested I take some time off. I refused. How could I explain that leaving felt like abandoning my post, like breaking a vigil I hadn't agreed to keep, but couldn't bring myself to end? I discovered the solution by accident. Among the theater's collection of old reels was a print of Carnival of Souls so damaged it was barely watchable. Scratches, burns, missing frames that made the narrative stutter and jump. I'd been meaning to dispose of it, but something made me leave it in the booth one Tuesday night. When I returned Wednesday morning, it sat exactly where I'd left it, unchanged, unimproved, and somehow that felt like a victory. So I made it my offering. Every Tuesday, I'd thread that damaged print onto the second projector, not to run it, but just to have it ready. The other films stopped moving. The reflection grew fainter, though never completely disappearing. The doors remained unlocked when they should be. It was like I'd found the right frequency, the correct ritual to maintain an uneasy peace with whatever haunted the Orpheum's projection booth. But peace never lasts in places where the past refuses to stay buried. The night I got trapped on the catwalk changed everything. It was a Tuesday in December, the last showing of Rebecca before the Christmas break. I'd gone to adjust one of the overhead speakers that had developed a rattle, a simple fix that required accessing the narrow walkway suspended above the orchestra seats. The catwalk was original to the building, wrought iron, painted black, barely wide enough for one person, and accessible only through a service door behind the projection booth. The moment I stepped onto it, I knew something was wrong. The air felt denser, older, like breathing through wet velvet. The theater below was empty. I'd watched the last patron leave through the lobby cameras, but as I moved toward the speaker, a sound rose from the darkness below. Applause. Slow, deliberate, from a single pair of hands. I froze, gripping the railings until my knuckles went white. The clapping continued, keeping time with the projector's mechanical rhythm still audible from the booth behind me. Then I saw the source, or thought I did. Third row center, a figure in pale clothing, though the darkness made it impossible to see clearly. The hands moved in that same measured beat, but what terrified me wasn't the presence of someone who shouldn't be there. It was the way the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the entire theater itself was applauding. I tried to back toward the service door, but my feet wouldn't respond properly. Each step felt like moving through thick syrup. the iron grating beneath me soft and yielding where it should have been solid. The figure in the third row stood, a fluid motion that seemed to ignore the constraints of physics. The pale dress caught light from sources that didn't exist, and for one horrible moment, I thought I could finally see the face. But there was no face, just a smooth expanse where features should have been, like looking at a reflection in disturbed water that never quite settles. The applause stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse, expectant, waiting, like the pause before a film's crucial revelation. Then the projector in the booth behind me started running backward. I could hear it through the walls, the distinctive sound of film reversing through the gate. But I hadn't loaded anything. I'd specifically avoided threading any film that night, hoping to prevent any incidents during my catwalk maintenance. The figure in the dress began moving up the aisle toward the stage, each step accompanied by a sound like film running through a projector. That distinctive clicking rhythm that had become the soundtrack to my increasing paranoia. As she walked, the theater itself seemed to respond. The Art Deco patterns on the walls began to shift and swirl, creating impossible geometries that hurt to perceive directly. The ceiling's painted stars, a feature from the original design, began to pulse with cold light. I managed to force myself back to the service door, but it wouldn't open. Not locked this time. The handle turned, the lock disengaged, but the door remained sealed as if the frame had contracted around it. Through the small window, I could see into the projection booth. Both projectors were running now, throwing images onto the screen below that shouldn't exist. Films that were never made, or perhaps films that were made but lost, forgotten, destroyed. I saw faces I recognized from photographs in the theater's archives. Previous projectionists, all of them, dating back decades. The figure reached the stage and turned to face the empty seats. When she raised her hands, the applause returned, but multiplied. Hundreds of invisible hands clapping in perfect synchronization, the sound building until it felt like physical pressure against my skull. The catwalk began to vibrate with it, the iron singing a high, thin note that made my teeth ache. That's when I understood. She wasn't haunting the theater. She was the theater's memory of all the audiences it had ever held, all the attention it had ever commanded, condensed into a single presence that demanded witness. And I was the witness, the projectionist who kept the ritual alive, who maintained the boundary between what was real and what was performance. The realization must have been what she wanted, because suddenly I could move again. The service door swung open so violently it slammed against the wall. I stumbled through, gasping, and found the projection booth exactly as I'd left it. No films running, no impossible images, just the steady hum of the digital projector on standby and that damaged copy of Carnival of Souls sitting where I always left it. But something had changed. The reflection in the observation window was clearer now. Not the woman, she was gone, but my own face, and behind it, dozens of others. Previous projectionists, perhaps, or maybe versions of myself fractured across possibility. All of us watching, waiting, maintaining our vigil in the booth that existed in more than 3 dimensions. I still work at the Orpheum, still maintain the equipment, thread the films, leave my offering of that damaged reel every Tuesday. The incidents have become more frequent but less frightening, or perhaps I've simply adapted to them. The films still move themselves sometimes, editing themselves into new narratives that no director intended. The doors still lock when they choose. The reflection still appears, though now I see it for what it is. Not a ghost, but an echo, a recording of attention itself burned into the architecture through decades of focused observation. The other employees have stopped expressing concern. They've accepted my eccentricities as part of the theater's charm, another quirk in a building full of them. Sometimes new hires ask about the strange sounds from the projection booth, the lights that pulse without cause, the sensation of being watched even in an empty theater. I tell them what the assistant manager told me. The building has personality. But late at night, when I'm alone in the booth with only the mechanical sounds of the projectors for company, I wonder if I'm still the projectionist, or if I've become part of the projection. The boundary blurs more each day. Sometimes I catch myself moving in sync with the films, my hands adjusting reels at the exact moment a character on screen reaches for something. Sometimes I know what frame the mysterious editor will choose before I check. The vigil continues. It has to. Someone needs to witness, to maintain the ritual, to keep the boundary stable between what the Orpheum was and what it's becoming, or perhaps what it always was, beneath the Art Deco facade and the restored grandeur. A machine for capturing attention, for preserving moments, for blurring the line between observer and observed, until neither can exist without the other. I've stopped photographing the evidence, stopped documenting the impossibilities. What would be the point? The Orpheum tells its own story, edits its own narrative, chooses its own moments of revelation. I'm just the projectionist, keeping the light running, maintaining the illusion that there's a difference between the screen and the booth, between the watcher and the watched. But sometimes, on Tuesday nights when the reflection is clearest, I wonder if I'm the one in the booth or the one in the glass. The thought should terrify me. Instead, I find it oddly comforting, like finally understanding my role in a film that's been running since 1928, projected onto screens that exist in more dimensions than the human eye can process, for an audience that never really left. The show, after all, must go on, oh. Story 2. The abandoned VA hospital sits like a wound in the mountains, its brutalist concrete facade bleeding rust down gray walls. I pass it twice a week on my delivery route through the West Virginia Appalachians, and each time my phone does the same thing. The carrier name flickers from Verizon to Vank Beckley Med for exactly 3 seconds before switching back. Every single time. That should have been warning enough. But 3 weeks ago, my buddies convinced me we needed to document the place before the state demolished it. Urban exploration, they called it. I called it trespassing, but I went anyway. Sometimes I wonder if part of me never really left. The October air bit through my jacket as we parked behind a cluster of dying pines, maybe a quarter mile from the main complex. My friend with the camera, let's call him the photographer, kept adjusting his equipment while our third companion, the one who'd found this place online, traced our entry route on his phone. The service bars dropped to nothing the moment we stepped past the rusted chain-link fence. The main building rose 5 stories above ground, but the real maze, according to the forums, sprawled beneath. 3 sublevels of medical storage, psychiatric wards, and something the VA record simply listed as auxiliary processing. The photographer had laughed at that, said it sounded like where they kept the alien autopsies. None of us laughed once we got inside. The ground floor matched every abandoned hospital photo I'd ever seen online, peeling mint green paint, overturned gurneys, ceiling tiles scattered like broken teeth across cracked linoleum. Dust motes swirled in the afternoon light streaming through broken windows. Our footsteps echoed wrong, though. Too loud going away from us, too soft coming back. The photographer noticed it too. He kept turning his head, listening to something I couldn't quite catch. The stairwell to the basement levels was behind what used to be the pharmacy, its heavy door marked with warnings about authorized personnel only. The lock had been cut years ago, probably by copper thieves. The moment we descended, the temperature dropped 15 degrees, and the air turned thick, medical somehow, like breathing through gauze soaked in rubbing alcohol. Emergency lighting still functioned on B1, impossible after 20 years, but there it was, casting everything in that sick sodium yellow glow. That's when we first saw the shadow corridor. Dead center of the main hallway, running its entire length, was a band of absolute darkness maybe 3 feet wide. Not an absence of light. The emergency lights clearly illuminated the floors and walls. It was like something invisible occupied that space, casting a shadow that shouldn't exist. The photographer raised his camera, but the autofocus just hunted back and forth, unable to lock onto anything. He switched to manual, snapped a few frames. Later, when we checked, those photos showed nothing but empty hallway. The shadow was only there when you looked directly at it. We tried to walk around it, hugging the left wall. That's when the first hydraulic door slammed shut behind us, a sound like a guillotine falling in slow motion. The photographer jumped and cursed, but our other friend just stared at the sealed door. These weren't automatic doors. They needed power, needed someone in the security office to trigger them. The security office that had been stripped of everything but bare concrete 20 years ago. Another door sealed when we tried the right wall, then another when we attempted to backtrack through radiology. The building was hurting us, funneling us deeper, and we all knew it, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. Speaking it would make it real, and we were still pretending this was just bad luck with old infrastructure. The shadow corridor led us inevitably to the sterilization suite on B2. Double doors marked with biohazard symbols and warnings in 3 languages. The moment we crossed that threshold, I heard it. The slow, deliberate rotation of gurney wheels. Not the sharp squeak of rust, but the smooth roll of well-oiled bearings. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, like it was being piped through speakers we couldn't see. But it was wrong. The rhythm was backward. You know how you can tell when a video is being played in reverse just from the sound? That's what this was. Wheels rolling backward, stopping, starting, rolling backward again. The photographer was practically hyperventilating by then, his breath fogging in the sudden cold. The sterilization suite was massive. Rows of empty autoclave chambers, their doors hanging open like mouths. Surgical instruments had been welded by rust to metal trays. Everything covered in that particular dust that comes from decades of stillness. Except for the tracks in the center of the floor. Fresh wheel marks in the dust, running in impossible loops and spirals, crossing over themselves in patterns that hurt to follow with your eyes. My radio, a simple walkie-talkie we'd brought in case we got separated, suddenly crackled to life. Clear as day through the static came a voice I didn't recognize. Mechanical, processed, like someone speaking through a vocoder. Unit 7, copy. I fumbled for the radio, nearly dropped it. The photographer grabbed my arm, shook his head. Don't answer it, his eyes said. But the voice continued. Unit 7, surgical prep complete, awaiting confirmation. Our third friend, who'd been silent since the first door closed, finally spoke. His words came out in a whisper. My grandfather died here, 1987. They lost him for 3 hours between surgery and recovery. Found him in the basement, naked, walking the halls. He kept saying they weren't finished with him yet. The radio crackled again. Unit 7, patient mobile. Please advise. That's when the lights started failing. Not all at once. They died in sequence, starting from the far end of the suite and moving toward us. Darkness swallowing the room in measured bites. The photographer broke first, running for the exit. We followed, that backward rolling sound pursuing us, getting closer but never quite catching up. I don't remember the path we took out. My memory just jumps from the sterilization suite to us standing in the parking lot, gasping in the clean mountain air, the photographer vomiting behind someone's abandoned truck. The sun had set. We'd been inside for 6 hours, but it felt like 30 minutes. We drove back in silence. Nobody wanted to process what had happened, and definitely nobody wanted to admit that we'd all heard our own names through that radio at some point during our escape. Not our nicknames, not the fake names we'd given each other for legal deniability. Our real, full names, spoken in that same metallic voice, followed always by surgical prep complete. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, things have been wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not horror movie wrong. Just off. The photographer says his cameras keep capturing shadows that aren't there when he looks with his naked eye. Our other friend moved back to his parents' house after he started sleepwalking, always toward the nearest hospital. And me? Besides my phone switching networks every time I pass that place, I've been having dreams. Always the same. I'm lying on a gurney in that sterilization suite, unable to move, watching shadows perform procedures I can't quite see. They work backward, undoing something, taking things out of me that were never put in. I wake up exhausted, with bruises I don't remember getting, in places that correspond exactly to where the shadows touch me in the dream. Yesterday, I found a medical bracelet on my wrist. Plastic, with a barcode and patient number. The kind they give you when you're admitted for surgery. The admission date was tomorrow. I cut it off, burned it in my sink. This morning, there was a new one. Same patient number. The admission date had updated to today. I'm sitting in my truck now, parked at the overlook where you can see the whole valley. The VA hospital squats in the distance, a darker shadow against the mountains. My phone shows 5 bars of signal, carrier name stable. But every few minutes, a text comes through from a number that's just zeros. Unit 7, return for completion. The rational part of my brain says we breathed in something toxic in that basement. Asbestos, black mold, some chemical cocktail that's making us hallucinate. That's why we're all experiencing connected delusions. That's why the symptoms are getting worse. We need medical attention, probably immediate. But the hospital my GPS keeps trying to route me to isn't the county medical center. It isn't the urgent care clinic. It's that abandoned VA building, and according to my phone, it's open 24 hours, accepts my insurance, and has an appointment already scheduled under my name. The sun is setting again. The photographer just texted me. His cameras captured something in his apartment last night. A figure in surgical scrubs, standing backward at the foot of his bed, face obscured by shadow. It was there in 37 consecutive frames, then gone. He's asking if we should go back, if maybe we left something behind that they want returned. Our other friend isn't answering his phone. His parents say he left for a walk 3 hours ago, headed toward the old railroad tracks. The tracks that run directly behind the VA hospital. I know what I should do. Drive to a real hospital, get checked for exposure to hazardous materials, file a police report about our friend, get psychiatric help for what's clearly a shared delusion brought on by toxic exposure and stress. Instead, I'm watching the last sunlight fade from the valley, and I'm thinking about that shadow corridor, about how it wasn't empty, we just couldn't see what was casting it, about how those wheel sounds were moving backward because something was being undone, about how my grandfather had his appendix removed at a VA hospital in 1983, and my medical records show no surgical scars. My phone buzzes. New carrier name, VAMC Beckley Med. It doesn't switch back this time. Another text from the zeros. Unit 7, prep complete. Patient returning. I'm not going back. I'm not. I'm going to drive home, pack my things, leave the state tonight. Start over somewhere flat and empty. Somewhere with no mountains, no abandoned buildings, no shadows that exist without sources. But even as I think this, my hand is turning the key. The engine starts. The GPS automatically calculates a route. 7 minutes to destination. The place that's been closed for 20 years. The place where something is waiting to finish what it started, or unstart what it finished, or complete some procedure that exists outside the normal flow of time and matter. I can see other headlights on the mountain road now, all heading the same direction. I wonder if the photographer is in one of those cars. I wonder if our friend is already there, walking those basement halls in a hospital gown that materialized from nowhere. I wonder what they took from us in that sterilization suite, or what they put in us, or what they're still doing in some parallel space where the hospital never closed, and the surgeries never end and the patients always return when called. The radio crackles one more time. My own voice, mechanical and processed, speaks from the speaker. Unit 7 confirmed. Returning for completion. I don't remember recording that. I don't remember a lot of things anymore. Like why I had that appendectomy scar last month but not today. Like why my blood type changed on my medical records. Like why I know, with absolute certainty, that something is missing from inside me, something that was never there to begin with. The hospital is dark against the sky, but I can see lights in the basement windows. Emergency lights that shouldn't exist, casting shadows that shouldn't be. My phone rings. The number is mine. I answer, because at this point, what else is there to do? The voice on the other end is mine, but not mine, speaking from somewhere that sounds like it's underwater or underground or both. We've been waiting for you to figure it out. You never left. You're still in the sterilization suite. We're just trying to wake you up. Please come back so we can wake you up. I look at my hands on the steering wheel. They're translucent in the dashboard light, veins and bones visible like an X-ray. The admission bracelet is back, but now it's part of my skin, the plastic fused with flesh. The hospital looms larger. I can see figures in the windows now, surgical masks, patient gowns, all facing backward, all waiting. My last rational thought is this. If I'm still in that basement hallucinating all of this, then driving to the hospital can't hurt. And if this is real, if something impossible happened in that shadow corridor, then fighting it is pointless. Either way, I'm going back. The GPS announces arrival at destination. The building that's been closed for 20 years has a lit emergency sign. The parking lot that should be cracked and overgrown is freshly paved, filled with cars that shouldn't exist. I recognize one of them. It's mine, covered in 3 weeks of dust, parked exactly where we left it that day. Which means the me driving this truck, the me thinking these thoughts, the me who's been living these 3 weeks. The radio speaks one final time, in that mechanical voice that I now understand has always been my own. Unit 7, welcome back. You never left. Time to complete the procedure. The truck I'm driving dissolves. The road dissolves. Everything dissolves except the sound of wheels rolling backward and the taste of antiseptic in my mouth and the knowledge that some surgeries can't be undone, especially the ones that never happened, especially the ones that are still happening, especially the ones that will always be happening in the shadow corridor of a basement that exists outside of time. I open my eyes. Fluorescent lights, surgical masks, the photographer standing over me, except his face is backward on his head. Our other friend is here too, lying on the next gurney, his chest open but empty, the cavity filled with shadow. We had to go deeper, the backward photographer says, his voice coming from somewhere behind his skull, to find what they took, to reclaim what was never ours. I try to speak, but my mouth is full of radio static. I try to move, but my body is 3 weeks in the past. I try to scream, but the sound comes out as wheelchairs rolling in reverse, forever and ever, in the basement of a building that's been closed for 20 years and will never close, has never been open and will never open, exists and doesn't exist in the same space, in the same moment, in the same shadow. My phone, wherever it is, whatever it is now, still shows 5 bars of signal. The carrier name reads, "You never left." And I know, with the certainty that comes with dreams and madness and whatever this is, that every time I drive past this place, because I will drive past it, because I am driving past it, because I have always been driving past it, my phone will remind me, you never left. We never left. We're still there, in the shadow corridor, walking toward a room we've already entered, leaving a place we'll never escape, completing a procedure that started before we arrived and will finish after we're gone. The emergency lights flicker in a pattern I almost recognize. Morse code maybe, or a heartbeat, or the rhythm of wheels rolling backward through time. Unit 7, returning for completion. Forever. Story 3. The measuring cup hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before it slammed into the refrigerator. I'd been living in the Portland studio for 6 days when it happened. The impact left a perfect circle in the stainless steel. Not a dent, but a discoloration that looked burned into the metal. I stood there, flour still clinging to my hands, watching the cup roll across the linoleum floor until it came to rest against the baseboard. The apartment had seemed perfect when I'd signed the lease. Furnished, affordable, and most importantly, it had a kitchen. Small, yes, but functional enough for someone like me who needed to test recipes for the cookbook I was supposedly writing. The landlord had been eager, too eager I realized later, to rent it month to month. After the measuring cup incident, I started paying attention. The kitchen scale would zero itself whenever I added ingredients by weight. Not immediately, but with a deliberate slowness, the digital numbers counting backward as if someone were pressing the tear button in reverse. At first I blamed faulty wiring or a dying battery. I replaced the batteries 3 times. The behavior persisted, but when I cooked by instinct, a pinch of salt here, a splash of oil there, everything worked perfectly. The gas burners would even click to life on their own, blue flames dancing beneath my pan at exactly the right moment. I'd reach for the knob to adjust the heat and find it already turning under my fingers. I started talking aloud while I cooked, partly to fill the oppressive silence, partly because I'd read somewhere that verbal processing helps with recipe development. The kitchen seemed to like this. The burners would click in response, a metallic applause for my rambling monologues about texture and flavor profiles. Sometimes I'd hear other sounds too, a cabinet door settling, the refrigerator humming a new tune, the garbage disposal grinding briefly without being switched on. The scratches inside the cabinet door haunted me more than anything else. 4 parallel grooves, deep enough to catch my fingernail, running from top to bottom. They looked fresh despite the yellowed paint around them. I'd run my fingers over them obsessively, feeling the desperation in those marks. Someone had wanted out. But out of what? It was just a cabinet. By the 3rd week, I'd developed a routine. Wake at 7, coffee with no measurements, just pour until it feels right. Breakfast by instinct. Work on my laptop at the small table until noon, trying to ignore the way shadows moved wrong in my peripheral vision. Lunch prepared with theatrical narration, describing each step to my invisible audience. The afternoon spent walking Portland's wet streets, delaying my return as long as possible. The nights were worse. The kitchen would come alive after dark, subtle at first. The tick of cooling metal, the drip of a faucet I'd sworn I'd turned off. But as the hours crept toward midnight, the sounds grew bolder. Drawers would slide open just enough for me to notice from my bed. The microwave would beep once, twice, then fall silent. I stopped measuring anything. It wasn't worth the rebellion. My recipes became suggestions rather than formulas. Cook until it smells right. Add liquid until the consistency speaks to you. My editor complained about the lack of precision, but the food I produced had never been better. Every dish came out perfectly, as if guided by an experienced hand that wasn't quite my own. The presence in the kitchen grew stronger. I could feel it watching when I cooked, adjusting my movements with invisible pressure. My hand would drift toward paprika instead of cayenne. I'd find myself adding ingredients I hadn't planned to use, creating combinations that shouldn't work but did. The kitchen was teaching me, or perhaps forcing me to remember something I'd never learned. One evening while making pasta, I decided to test the boundaries. I pulled out my measuring cups, determined to follow a recipe exactly. The moment I poured flour into the cup, the overhead light flickered. A warning. I kept going, leveling off the excess with a knife. The light went out completely. In the darkness, I heard movement. Not quite footsteps, but a shifting presence that seemed to occupy the space between the counter and the stove. My eyes adjusted slowly to the streetlight filtering through the window. The measuring cup wasn't where I'd left it. It was floating again, rotating slowly at eye level. I reached for it, and it pulled away, drifting toward the refrigerator like it was magnetized. This time, I grabbed it before impact. The metal was ice cold, painful to hold. I let go, and it clattered to the floor, leaving my palm red and aching. The lights came back on. I finished the pasta without measurements, and it was the best I'd ever made. The next morning, I found new scratches on the cabinet door. Not inside this time, but outside. 5 marks, one more than before, as if whatever was trapped had gained a finger or lost one trying to escape. The paint around them was fresh, wet even, though I hadn't heard anything during the night. I started researching the apartment's history, but found nothing unusual. No deaths, no reports of problems. The previous tenant had stayed only 2 months, the one before that, 6 weeks. The pattern went back years, a revolving door of short-term renters, none staying long enough to leave a real impression. Except for the scratches. I wondered how many sets of marks were hidden under layers of paint. The kitchen's personality became more distinct as autumn deepened. It hated precision, but loved creativity. It despised timers, but rewarded intuition. When I tried to document my recipes, my laptop would freeze, the screen flickering with static that formed almost patterns, almost words. But when I cooked from memory and instinct, describing my process aloud like a demented cooking show host, the kitchen hummed with satisfaction. I realized I'd stopped eating out entirely. The thought of food prepared elsewhere made my stomach turn. Only meals from this kitchen satisfied me now, as if I'd developed a specific addiction to whatever essence infused the food here. My friends commented on how thin I'd gotten. but I felt stronger than ever, my movements in the kitchen becoming more fluid, more automatic. The boundaries between my actions and the kitchen's suggestions blurred. I'd reach for ingredients before consciously deciding what to make. My hands would move through preparations I didn't remember learning. Once, I caught myself humming a tune I didn't recognize while julienning vegetables with perfect precision, no ruler needed, each piece exactly the same size. The scratches multiplied. New ones appeared weekly, sometimes daily. Not just on the cabinet door now, but inside drawers, along the underside of the counter, behind the stove where I only found them because I'd dropped a spoon. They varied in number, 4, 5, sometimes 6 parallel lines. Different hands, or the same hand changing. I stopped sleeping well. In dreams, I was inside the cabinet, my fingers raw from scratching at wood that wouldn't yield. I'd wake with my hands clenched, fingernails digging into my palms, leaving marks that mirrored those throughout the kitchen. One night, while making a late dinner, I spoke directly to it. Not the casual narration I'd grown accustomed to, but actual address. I asked what it wanted. The room fell silent. Even the refrigerator's constant hum ceased. The air grew thick, pressing against my eardrums. Then slowly, the gas burner in front of me ignited. Not the quick whoosh of normal ignition, but a gradual emergence of flame, growing from nothing like a thought becoming real. I understood then, or thought I did. The kitchen didn't want to be measured, contained, reduced to numbers and rules. It wanted to create through me or with me or as me. The scratches weren't from someone trying to escape. They were from someone trying to hold on, to resist being pulled into this collaborative madness. But understanding didn't bring relief. Each meal I prepared felt less like my own creation. My hands moved too surely, knew too much. I'd find myself using techniques I'd never studied, combining flavors from cuisines I'd never explored. The food was extraordinary, but it wasn't mine. I tried to leave once. Packed my laptop, some clothes, headed for the door. But the hunger hit me before I reached the street, not for food, but for the act of cooking in that space. My hands shook with withdrawal. My mouth went dry. I made it 3 blocks before turning back, keys already in my hand before I'd consciously decided to return. The kitchen welcomed me back with the gentle tick of cooling metal, like a satisfied sigh. Now I cook constantly. Not because I need to eat. I barely taste what I make anymore, but because the kitchen demands it. My fingers move across cutting boards and stovetops with practiced precision that isn't practice, isn't precision, isn't even really mine. I describe each action aloud, my voice growing hoarse from the constant narration. The scratches on the cabinet door have become a calendar of my diminishing resistance. Sometimes, in the reflection of the refrigerator's damaged surface, I see movement that isn't me. A figure standing where I stand, hands moving where my hands move, but slightly out of sync, as if one of us is the echo of the other. I've stopped trying to determine which of us is real. My editor wants the cookbook finished. She calls less frequently now, put off by the way I describe recipes in terms of feeling rather than measurement, instinct rather than instruction. But the kitchen doesn't care about deadlines or publishing contracts. It only cares about the next meal, the next improvisation, the next merger of its will and mine. I found new scratches this morning. 7 parallel lines, deeper than any before, still bleeding sap from the wounded wood. But when I looked at my hands, my fingernails were clean, unbroken. The measuring cup still sits where it fell that first time, gathering dust against the baseboard. I don't touch it anymore. The kitchen has made its preferences clear, and I've learned to stop resisting. Or maybe I've forgotten how to resist. Or maybe, and this is the thought that follows me into my dreams, maybe I never was resisting. Maybe I was always meant to be here, in this small Portland kitchen, cooking by instinct rather than instruction, guided by a presence that might be haunting or might be teaching, or might be something else entirely. Maybe those scratches aren't warnings but invitations, each parallel line a finger learning to let go of precision, of control, of the illusion that we ever really cook alone. The sun is setting now, October light slanting through the window, and I need to start dinner. The kitchen is humming, expectant. My hands are already moving toward ingredients I haven't consciously chosen. I'll cook until it feels right, until the kitchen is satisfied, until I can't remember what it felt like to measure anything at all. Story 4. The first time I noticed the pattern, I was unpacking boxes in the kitchen, still drunk on the satisfaction of owning something built before the Depression. The realtor had warned me about the house's quirks: old plumbing, original hardwood that creaked in specific spots, windows that wouldn't stay open without props. She hadn't mentioned the cabinets. I'd opened them out of order that Sunday morning. Pantry first, then plates, finally cups. The sound that followed wasn't quite a slam, more like a firm disagreement. 3 measured knocks from inside the pantry, deliberate as a judge's gavel. When I reopened them in what I'd later learn was the correct sequence: cups, plates, pans. The house seemed to exhale, settling into itself with a satisfied groan that traveled through the walls. Detroit has thousands of these houses, abandoned and reclaimed, abandoned again, each cycle leaving its residue in the bones of the structure. Mine sat on a corner lot in Corktown, red brick darkened by decades of automotive exhaust, windows tall and narrow like suspicious eyes. The previous owner had died somewhere else, a nursing home in Dearborn, the realtor mentioned, but he'd lived here alone for 43 years after his wife passed. The neighbors knew him only as the man who kept his lawn immaculate and never answered his door after dark. I spent the first week attributing everything to the house's age. Old houses have personalities, I told myself, unconscious rhythms established by decades of habit. The cabinet thing became routine quickly enough. Every morning, cups first, then plates, then pans. The knocking stopped. I considered it a victory of adaptation, but the mirrors were harder to rationalize. The ornate one in the living room, a heavy Victorian piece that came with the house, never stayed where I positioned it. Not dramatically, just a few inches each night, always angling itself to capture the hallway that led to the bedrooms. I'd square it against the wall before bed, wake to find it tilted, offering a perfect view down that dark corridor. I tried marking its position with pencil on the wallpaper. The marks moved too. By the third week, Wednesday had become a day I dreaded. That's when the shadow performed its routine. Always at dusk, when the dying light made everything questionable, a darkness would gather at the bedroom doorframe. Not quite a figure, more like a thickening of air. It would lean into view, pull back, then materialize in the living room's corner behind the relocated mirror. The first time, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light through the elm tree outside. The second Wednesday, I closed all the curtains before sunset. The shadow kept its appointment anyway, punctual as a bureaucrat. The house had other preferences I discovered through trial and error. The bathroom door needed to close completely. Leaving it ajar resulted in a persistent dripping that no amount of faucet tightening could stop. The basement light switch required a double flip, up, down, up, or the bulb would burn out within hours. The front door's mail slot would snap shut on fingers unless you announced yourself first with a knock. I started keeping a notebook, documenting each requirement, each ritual the house demanded. My handwriting grew increasingly cramped as the pages filled. The morning routine alone took 17 specific steps. Which floorboards to avoid, the correct angle for opening curtains, the precise pressure needed on the kitchen faucet to prevent that keening whistle. I found myself moving through the house like a dancer who'd learned his choreography through pain, each misstep immediately corrected by the house's sharp reminders. Sleep became elusive, not from fear exactly, but from a hypervigilance that wouldn't let me rest. The house was always adjusting, always insisting. The sound of settling wood became a language I was desperate to decode. Was that creak approval or warning? Did the radiator's clang mean I'd forgotten something? I researched the previous owner obsessively. His name appeared in a few archived newspaper clippings. Nothing substantial, just mentions in neighborhood association meetings. A photo from a 1987 block party where he stood at the edge of the frame, turned slightly away. His wife's obituary from 1980 was more revealing. She'd been a piano teacher, beloved for her precise methods and exacting standards. The phrase stuck with me as I performed my morning cabinet ritual. The breaking point came on a Wednesday in November. I'd decided to resist, to ignore the shadow's schedule, to assert my ownership over this space I'd paid for. I left work early, arrived home at 3, and planted myself in the living room with every light blazing. I moved the mirror flat against the wall and pushed the couch against it to hold it there. By 5:30, the house had begun its objections. The cabinet doors swung open in reverse order, pans, plates, cups, spilling their contents across the kitchen floor in ceramic protest. The bathroom began its dripping, accelerating to a steady stream that overwhelmed the sink. The basement light flickered through its entire inventory of bulbs, burning through replacements I hadn't even installed yet. But I held my position, even as the mirror behind me began to vibrate against the couch, even as the elm shadows reached through the windows in impossible directions. I would not be trained. I would not perform. At exactly 6:17, the shadow appeared anyway. Not at the doorframe, not in its usual spots, but directly in front of me, standing between me and the television I'd turned on for distraction. It wasn't transparent. I couldn't see through it, but it also wasn't solid. It occupied space without mass, presence without form. It tilted what might have been a head, studying me with the patience of someone teaching a particularly slow student. Then it moved, not quickly, but deliberately, walking through the room in a specific pattern. 3 steps toward the kitchen, pause, turn left, 5 steps to the hallway, pause, turn right, 2 steps to the mirror. It repeated this path 3 times, while I sat frozen, my rebellion evaporating into recognition. This wasn't random. This was instruction. I understood then what the house had been trying to teach me. Not obedience, but participation. Every resident leaves their rhythm in these walls, their daily patterns worn into the spiritual floorboards like paths through grass. The previous owner, 43 years of solitary routine, had etched his life so deeply into this space that the house couldn't remember any other way to be. I stood, my legs unsteady, and followed the shadow's path. 3 steps, pause, turn, 5 steps, pause, turn, 2 steps. The house sighed. I felt it in my chest, and the chaos stopped. Cabinets closed, water ceased, lights steadied. The shadow nodded, or seemed to, and dissolved. Since then, I've become fluent in the house's language. I know now that the morning cabinet sequence was his wife's. She always started with coffee, thus cups first. The mirror placement was her too, checking her appearance one final time before teaching lessons in the converted bedroom. Wednesdays were his grocery days. The shadow's path the exact route from bedroom to kitchen to front door, checking locks and lights. I live here now, but I'm not alone. I'm part of a continuing performance, a play that runs every day with prescribed movements and careful timing. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I simply left, abandoned this stage and its demanding choreography. But I know the answer. The house would wait, patient as always, for the next player to learn their part. Last week, I caught myself correcting a delivery person who'd knocked too softly on the front door. I heard myself explaining the proper technique. 3 firm raps, pause, announce yourself, and saw his expression shift from confusion to concern. He left the package on the porch and practically ran back to his truck. I've started to notice my own patterns solidifying. The way I always check the mirror's angle now before heading to bed, ensuring it frames the hallway just so. How I've begun shopping on Wednesdays, following that same path through the house before leaving. The notebook I once used to document the house's demands has become a script I follow without thinking. Sometimes late at night I wonder who's training whom. Am I learning the house's rhythm, or is it learning mine? Will some future owner find themselves compelled to check their phone at exactly 10:47 p.m., as I do now, standing in the spot where the Wi-Fi signal is strongest? Will they feel the urgent need to water the non-existent plants by the eastern window every Tuesday, a habit I've developed for reasons I can't explain? The realtor calls occasionally, checking in with the friendly persistence of someone who suspects a commission might reverse itself. I tell her everything's fine, the house and I are getting along well. This isn't entirely false. We've reached an understanding, the house and I, though I'm no longer certain who made the compromises. Yesterday, I saw my reflection in that living room mirror and didn't immediately recognize myself. My posture had changed, shoulders pulled back in a way that reminded me of the old photograph. The previous owner at the edge of the frame turned slightly away, as if listening to something only he could hear, or perhaps following cues only he could see. The house creaks its approval as I write this, sitting in what I've learned was her piano teaching spot, the acoustics perfect for projecting sound down the hallway. My fingers move across the keyboard in a rhythm that feels both foreign and familiar, typing words that seem to emerge from the walls themselves. 3 knocks from the pantry. It's time for the evening routine. The shadow will appear soon. It's Wednesday, and I'll trace the shopping path even though I bought groceries yesterday. The mirror needs adjusting. It's shifted a 1/4 inch since morning, disrupting the sight line. I stand, my movements fluid with practice, and begin the dance. Behind me, I swear I hear applause, soft, polite, the kind you'd give a student who's finally mastered a difficult piece. The house settles around me, satisfied for now with my performance. Tomorrow I'm having new locks installed. The workman will need to know the proper way to announce himself at the door. 3 knocks. Firm, but not aggressive. Then wait. The house is particular about its guests now. We are particular about our guests. Story 5. The smell hit me first. That particular cocktail of old wood, dampness, and something else I couldn't place. Something that reminded me of pennies left in a pocket too long. Dad had warned us the farmhouse would need work, but he hadn't mentioned how the air itself seemed to resist our presence, pushing back against our lungs with each breath. We'd driven up from the city on a Tuesday, Mom clutching the rental agreement like a lifeline while Dad navigated the winding roads of upstate New York. The house squatted against the tree line, its weathered clapboard siding the color of old bones. Victorian in style, but stripped of any grandeur, it looked more like a patient than a home, something waiting for care that might never come. The previous tenants had left in a hurry. This became apparent when we found their belongings scattered throughout. A child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, magazines from 3 months ago still splayed across the coffee table, and most unsettling of all, a collection of small notes tucked into door frames and taped to walls. Claudia prefers the kitchen light left on. Don't close the bathroom door completely, she gets restless. When the hallway gets cold, acknowledge her. Just nod. It helps. My older brother found this amusing. He'd always been the skeptical one, the engineering student who could explain away every bump in the night with thermal expansion or settling foundations. He crumpled up the first few notes he encountered, tossing them into the trash with theatrical disdain. I kept reading them. The notes spoke of Claudia with an odd familiarity, as if they were house rules left for a pet sitter. Instructions for coexisting with something that belonged here more than we did. The handwriting varied, sometimes careful cursive, sometimes hurried print, suggesting multiple family members had contributed to this strange documentation. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, facing north toward the woods. The wallpaper was a faded floral pattern that seemed to shift in my peripheral vision, and the hardwood floors creaked with each step in a sequence that almost sounded like a melody. But what caught my attention immediately was the trapdoor. It sat flush against the baseboard near the window, about 3 feet square, painted the same cream color as the walls but visible due to the seams in the wood, and a small brass handle that had been painted over multiple times. Someone had nailed it shut, but the nails looked fresh, their heads still bright silver against the old paint. When I asked Dad about it, he shrugged and suggested it probably led to storage space or old plumbing access. Mom thought it might be a root cellar entrance. Neither seemed particularly concerned, though I noticed Dad's eyes linger on it longer than his casual tone suggested. The first night, I woke to the sound of my brother's voice drifting through the thin walls. Yes, I'm awake. I lay still, listening. Our rooms shared a wall, and I could hear him clearly when he spoke in normal tones, but there was something odd about his voice. It carried that thick, slurred quality of sleep speech, yet his responses seemed too coherent, too immediate. I already checked it. A pause. The window is closed. Another pause, longer this time. I said I already checked it. I pressed my ear to the wall. The responses came at regular intervals, as if he were participating in a conversation. But I heard no other voice, no questions that might prompt such specific answers. Just my brother, apparently responding to someone I couldn't hear. In the morning, he looked exhausted. When I asked about his night, he claimed to have slept deeply, dreamlessly. The dark circles under his eyes suggested otherwise. The second night, I decided to investigate. I waited until the house had been quiet for an hour, then crept to the hallway that separated our rooms. The temperature difference hit me immediately. While the rest of the upstairs maintained the muggy warmth of late summer, the hallway felt like stepping into a walk-in freezer. My breath misted in front of me, and goosebumps erupted along my arms. The cold seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, not flowing from any particular source, but simply existing in that specific space. I stood there for several minutes, watching my breath fog and dissipate, when my brother's voice started again. "Yes, I can hear you." The words came from his room, muffled by the door, but distinct. I moved closer, my bare feet silent on the hardwood. "It's already open." I tested his doorknob, unlocked. Through the crack, I could see his form in the bed, apparently asleep but speaking clearly into the darkness. "I know what you want." The way he said it made my skin crawl, not the confused mumbling of typical sleep talking, but a resigned acknowledgement, as if he were responding to a persistent request he could no longer ignore. I spent the next hour sitting in the hallway, shivering in that inexplicable cold, listening to one side of a conversation that shouldn't exist. My brother's responses grew more specific as the night wore on. Directions to various parts of the house, confirmations of actions he claimed to have completed, and finally, just before dawn, something that made my blood freeze. "The one downstairs won't budge." I tried. When morning came, the hallway returned to normal temperature. My brother woke refreshed, insisting he'd slept wonderfully. But when I casually mentioned the old trapdoor in my room, his face went pale. "You shouldn't mess with that," he said quickly, then caught himself. "I mean, it's probably just old storage space. Nothing interesting." But his eyes betrayed him. He'd been thinking about that trapdoor too. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Each night, the hallway would drop in temperature sometime after midnight. My brother would begin his strange conversations, growing more animated and responsive as the hours passed. And during the day, I began to notice small changes throughout the house. Items moved, nothing dramatic. A book relocated from the coffee table to the mantelpiece. A coffee mug migrated from the kitchen counter to the windowsill. My toothbrush found its way from the bathroom to the hallway floor. Each relocation seemed random until I began mapping them. Everything moved toward my room. More specifically, toward the trapdoor. The book ended up on my dresser, spine facing the painted wood. The coffee mug appeared on my nightstand. My toothbrush materialized on the floor directly in front of the sealed entrance. Other items followed. Mom's reading glasses, Dad's keys, a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer, all finding their way to my room like metal shavings drawn to a magnet. When I mentioned these relocations to my family, they seemed genuinely puzzled. Mom suggested she might have moved things absent-mindedly while cleaning. Dad blamed the stress of the move. My brother just shrugged, though I caught him staring at the items with an expression I couldn't quite read. The notes we'd found began to make more sense. Claudia wasn't just the previous family's pet name for whatever presence they'd sensed. She was something that organized, that moved things according to her own logic. And her logic seemed focused on that sealed trapdoor. 3 weeks after our arrival, I decided to test something. That night, I arranged several items around my room in specific positions. A glass of water on the windowsill, a pen on the desk, my wallet on the dresser. I went to sleep with my phone's camera recording, positioned to capture the area around the trapdoor. I woke to find everything rearranged. The glass sat directly on the trapdoor's painted surface. The pen lay alongside it like an arrow pointing to the brass handle, and my wallet had been opened. Its contents spread in a perfect circle around the sealed entrance. The recording showed nothing. 6 hours of footage revealed no movement, no shadows, No explanation for the transformation of my carefully arranged room. But in the final minutes before dawn, the camera had picked up something else. The sound of my brother's voice through the wall, clearer than ever before. I understand, but I can't make him do it. A pause. He has to choose. Another pause, longer. The nails are old. They'll come out easily. I replayed that segment dozens of times, each viewing filling me with deeper unease. The conversation implied negotiation, bargaining, and the subject of that bargaining appeared to be me. That evening, I confronted my brother directly. He was in the living room, reading a magazine with intense focus that seemed forced. "What did you mean about the nails being old?" He looked up, and for just a moment, his expression was entirely blank. Not confused or surprised, but empty, as if someone else were looking out through his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about. Last night, you said the nails are old, that they'd come out easily." I don't remember saying that. But his hands were trembling as he turned the page, and when he looked back at me, I saw something I'd never seen in my brother's face before. Fear. Not of me, but of something else entirely. Something that was using our conversations to communicate. That night, I didn't go to my room. Instead, I set up camp in the living room, determined to avoid whatever strange influence was affecting my brother's sleep. But around midnight, I found myself standing up without conscious decision, walking toward the stairs with steps that felt both deliberate and involuntary. The hallway was arctic. My breath came in sharp puffs as I moved toward my room, guided by an intention that didn't feel entirely my own. Behind me, my brother's voice started up again, but tonight the tone was different, urgent, almost pleading. "He's going. Don't push too hard." I reached my bedroom door and found it slightly ajar, though I distinctly remembered closing it. The items from my previous night's experiment had been rearranged again, forming a more complex pattern around the trapdoor. The glass now sat precisely on the brass handle. The pen pointed directly at the fresh nails. My wallet lay open with all the bills and cards arranged in a perfect spiral. But tonight there was something new. A small crowbar, placed parallel to the trapdoor's edge. I'd never seen it before, and I was certain it hadn't been in the house when we arrived. I knelt beside the trapdoor, my hands moving independently of my conscious thought. The crowbar felt familiar in my grip, as if I'd used it many times before. The first nail came out easily, just as my brother had promised. Then the second. The third. As I worked, my brother's voice continued from the next room, but now his words seemed to be describing my actions in real time. "He's almost finished. Just 2 more. The fourth nail resisted slightly, but a little pressure from the crowbar freed it. "1 more. He's being very careful." The final nail came out with a soft screech of metal against wood. The trapdoor sat unrestrained now, held closed only by paint that had dried over the seams and my own reluctance to lift it. "It's ready," my brother announced to his unseen conversational partner. My hand was on the brass handle before I fully realized I'd reached for it. The metal was warm, as if someone else had been gripping it moments before. I could feel a slight vibration through the wood, like a heartbeat pulsing just below the surface. The paint seal cracked as I applied upward pressure. Whatever lay beneath that trapdoor had been waiting patiently, and now only thin layers of dried latex stood between us. I stopped. Some part of my mind, the part that had been observing this entire sequence with growing horror, finally reasserted control. I released the handle and scrambled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. From the next room, my brother's voice took on a disappointed tone. "He stopped. He's afraid." I ran from the room, down the stairs, and out the front door into the humid night air. Behind me, the house seemed to pulse with disapproval, its windows dark but somehow watchful. I spent that night in my car, windows cracked for air but doors locked, staring up at the farmhouse until dawn. My brother found me there in the morning looking haggard and confused. "Why are you out here?" he asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew. "I almost opened it," I told him. He nodded slowly, and for the first time in weeks, He looked like my actual brother again, worried, protective, completely present. "The family before us," he said quietly. "I think they left because someone actually did." We stared at each other across the gulf of implication. Whatever Claudia was, whatever she wanted, the previous tenants had discovered it through direct experience, and they'd fled, leaving only their warning notes and the hurriedly replaced nails as evidence of their encounter. "We should leave," I said. My brother looked back at the house, and I saw him shiver despite the morning warmth. "We should," he agreed. But we didn't. Not that day, or the next, or the one after that, because leaving would require explaining to our parents why we needed to abandon the lease. And how could we explain what we barely understood ourselves? How could we describe the weight of invisible presence, the reorganization of objects according to incomprehensible logic, the conversations conducted through sleep speech with something that had never been human? Instead, we developed our own system of notes, guidelines for coexistence that we never discussed aloud, but implemented through wordless agreement. Don't be alone in the upstairs hallway after midnight. If items move toward the trapdoor, leave them there. Don't listen to the conversations. Pretend you can't hear them. Never mention the basement entrance, if that's what it really is. Keep the nails in your pocket, just in case. Weeks passed. The pattern continued. My brother's nightly conversations grew shorter, more routine, as if whatever spoke through him was satisfied with our compliance. The temperature in the hallway still dropped each night, but it felt less aggressive, more like a gentle reminder of ongoing occupancy than a direct threat. I learned to sleep through the sound of my belongings reorganizing themselves, to wake each morning and find new configurations around the trapdoor without investigating their meaning. The glass, the pen, the wallet became permanent residents of that space, joined periodically by other household items that migrated north through invisible currents. But I kept the nails in my pocket, because some nights when the house felt particularly active and my brother's responses grew more animated, I would wake to find my hand already reaching for the brass handle. The metal would be warm with anticipation, vibrating slightly with whatever waited below, and only the hard press of those nails against my palm would remind me to let go. On our final night in the farmhouse, though we didn't know it would be our last, something changed. I woke to find myself standing in the hallway, that now familiar Arctic breath misting around me. But tonight the cold felt different. Not threatening, but sad, almost lonely. My brother's voice was softer than usual, more like actual conversation than the clipped responses of recent weeks. "I know you're leaving tomorrow," he said to the empty air of his room. We hadn't told anyone we were leaving. Dad had received a job offer back in the city, and we'd made the decision that afternoon to cut the lease short and return home. But somehow she already knew. "You want us to stay." A longer pause than usual. "We can't. We're not like the others. We're not ready." I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to understand what "ready" might mean in this context. Maybe someday, but not now. Through my brother's door, I could see him sitting up in bed, fully awake but speaking to something I couldn't see. His voice carried a gentleness I'd never heard before, as if he were comforting a disappointed child. "You'll find others. You're patient." The conversation continued for another hour, but the tone had shifted entirely. Instead of commands and responses, it sounded like negotiation, even farewell. And when dawn broke and my brother finally fell silent, the house felt different. Not empty, but resigned. We packed quickly that morning. As I loaded my belongings into boxes, I left the glass, pen, and wallet in their positions around the trapdoor. It seemed wrong to disturb an arrangement that had taken so much effort to perfect. The brass nails I scattered across the painted wood, but I didn't hammer them back in. That felt like someone else's choice to make. As our car pulled away from the farmhouse, I looked back once. In the second-story window, my former bedroom, a shadow moved past the glass. Just for a moment, just long enough to acknowledge our departure. My brother saw it too. He raised his hand in a small wave, and I swear the shadow paused before moving away from the window. We never discussed what happened during those weeks. Not with our parents, not with each other, not even in the careful notes we'd developed for managing our strange coexistence. Some experiences resist explanation, existing in the spaces between rational thought and undeniable sensation. But sometimes, late at night in my apartment back in the city, I wake to find small objects rearranged in my room. A book moved from the nightstand to the dresser, a glass relocated from the kitchen to my bedroom floor. My keys found in perfect alignment with the baseboard, as if pointing toward some unseeable entrance. And I know that patience, once established, can span any distance. I keep nails in my pocket now, old ones, their heads bright silver against time-darkened shanks, because some doorways, once identified, never really close. They simply wait for the right moment, the right person, the right degree of readiness to finally swing open. The arrangement, it seems, is ongoing, and someday, maybe next month, maybe next year, I might find myself curious enough, lonely enough, or simply tired enough of wondering to see what Claudia has been so carefully organizing all along. The brass handle grows warmer each night. Story 6. The booking confirmation arrived 3 months before my trip, complete with a photograph that sealed my decision. A suspended glass walkway connecting 2 stark concrete blocks, 30 feet above Reykjavik's snow-dusted streets. Perfect for aurora viewing, the description promised. What it didn't mention was how the glass would become a window into something I should never have seen. I'd chosen Iceland deliberately, chasing the northern lights after Elena left. The divorce papers still smelled of her perfume when I signed them, and I needed distance, geographic and emotional. The Norderljos Hotel offered both, isolation and spectacle, a glass corridor where I could lie flat and watch the sky dance green above me while the city slept below. The receptionist handed me the keycard with fingers that lingered too long on mine. Her English carried that distinctive Icelandic lilt, words rolling like distant thunder. She mentioned the walkway would be mine alone. Few guests bothered with the connecting wing this late in the season. The thought pleased me then. Solitude felt like medicine. My room occupied the eastern block's 7th floor, unremarkable except for the door that led to the walkway. The corridor stretched 20 meters of pure transparency, floor and walls and ceiling all glass, creating the illusion of walking through air. During daylight, it offered panoramic views of Reykjavik's colorful rooftops and the mountains beyond. At night, it promised an unobstructed view of the auroras. The first 2 nights yielded nothing but clouds and my own restless pacing. I'd brought a sleeping bag specifically for walkway camping, planning to spend entire nights horizontal on the glass, waiting for the lights. By the 3rd night, when the weather forecast finally promised clear skies, I was desperate for the distraction. I positioned myself center corridor around midnight, the sleeping bag providing minimal cushioning against the cold glass. The city lights twinkled below like fallen stars, and above, the first faint ribbons of green began their ethereal dance. I pressed my palms flat against the floor, feeling the temperature seep through the glass into my bones. The building's subtle vibrations transmitted through the structure. Distant elevators, heating systems, the pulse of urban life settling into sleep. That's when I first noticed the cold wasn't uniform. Certain sections of the glass felt measurably warmer, as if something on the other side was generating heat. I initially attributed this to thermal irregularities in the building's construction, but the warm spots formed patterns, 2 elongated ovals at shoulder height on the northern wall, exactly where someone might lean. The aurora intensified around 2 a.m., sheets of emerald light rippling across the star-drunk sky. I lay transfixed, my breath fogging the glass above me, when the first sound interrupted the silence. Tap. Delicate. Deliberate. The sound of a fingernail against glass. I held my breath, listening. The building's ambient sounds continued their mechanical symphony, but underneath, another rhythm emerged. Tap, 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 tap. 5 distinct sounds from my left, the southern wall. I turned my head slowly, peering through the glass into the night air beyond. Nothing but darkness and the aurora's glow. Then, from my right, tap, tap, tap. 3 taps, softer but unmistakably intentional. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized the impossible truth. Someone was tapping on the glass from outside. Outside, a 7th-floor walkway suspended in midair. I pushed myself to sitting, scanning the darkness beyond the glass walls. The tapping ceased. I waited, muscles coiled, wondering if my sleep-deprived mind was manufacturing sounds. The aurora continued its silent performance overhead, indifferent to my growing unease. Tap, 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 tap. Again from the left, more insistent now. I crawled toward the sound, pressing my face against the cold glass. The exterior darkness revealed nothing, but I felt observed, that primitive recognition of being prey under an unseen predator's gaze. Tap, tap, tap. The responding pattern from the right sent ice through my veins. Whatever was out there was following a sequence, a deliberate communication. I scrambled backward, the sleeping bag tangling around my legs. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Wind-blown debris, ice shifting on the building's exterior, thermal expansion causing the glass to pop. But those explanations crumbled when I saw the face. It appeared suddenly, pressed against the southern wall's glass. Human features flattened against the transparent barrier, distorted by the pressure. The skin looked pale as frost, the eyes dark hollows that seemed to fix on mine. The face appeared to float, supported by nothing, hair streaming as if caught in wind that didn't exist in the still night air. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The face remained for perhaps 5 seconds, long enough for me to register the full impossibility of its presence, before dissolving into the darkness, as if it had never been. My hands shook as I gathered the sleeping bag and fled to my room. I locked the door and checked it twice, then drew the curtains and sat on the bed's edge, trying to rationalize what I'd witnessed. Hallucinations brought on by sleep deprivation and altitude. A trick of the aurora's light creating false patterns in my peripheral vision. The stress of the divorce manifesting in paranoid delusions. But the tapping had been real. The sound had carried the unmistakable resonance of fingernail against glass. I avoided the walkway the next day, spending time in Reykjavik's cafes and museums, convincing myself that exhaustion had corrupted my perceptions. But as evening approached, I felt drawn back to the glass corridor. Not from curiosity, from compulsion. Whatever was happening there had hooked itself into my thoughts, demanding resolution. The 4th night, I armed myself with rational tools. A thermos of coffee to maintain alertness, my phone set to record audio, a small flashlight for illumination. I would document everything, prove to myself that the walkway held no supernatural secrets. I positioned myself in the corridor's center, phone recording, flashlight ready. The aurora began early, faint green brushstrokes against the star field. I lay on the glass, forcing myself to relax, waiting for sounds that wouldn't come. But they did come. Tap, 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 tap. Louder than before, more urgent. I grabbed the flashlight and directed its beam toward the sound. The light revealed nothing beyond the glass, just empty air 30 feet above the street. But the tapping continued, moving along the southern wall as if fingers were walking across the surface. Tap, tap, tap. The response from the northern wall made me swing the light in that direction. Again, nothing visible, but the sound was undeniable, captured by my phone's microphone. I had evidence now. Proof that something was interacting with the walkway from outside. The tapping ceased. In the sudden silence, I became aware of my own ragged breathing, the thunderous beating of my heart. Then I noticed the change in the glass itself. The southern wall had begun to fog from the inside, as if breath were condensing on its surface. But the fogging appeared on the exterior side of the glass, the impossible side, where no breath could exist in the frigid night air. The condensation spread in patches, forming vague outlines that resembled handprints, and the oval shape of a face pressed close, I watched, paralyzed, as the breath marks grew more defined. 2 palm prints flanking what could only be a nose and mouth impression. The glass grew increasingly opaque, blocking my view of the city lights beyond. The walkway felt suddenly claustrophobic, enclosed by walls that should have been transparent. The temperature began to drop. Not gradually, but precipitously, as if something was draining heat from the corridor itself. My breath came in visible puffs despite the building's heating system. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold when I checked it, though I'd poured it steaming hot less than an hour before. That's when I realized the fogging wasn't random. It was forming letters, backward letters, as if written from outside the glass looking in. I couldn't decipher the words immediately. The condensation kept shifting, clarifying, then dissolving. But the intentionality was unmistakable. Something was trying to communicate. I pressed closer to the glass, attempting to read the reversed message. The letters seemed to spell out fragments. Side. Wrong. World. My breath caught. The message appeared to be about sides, about wrong worlds, as if whatever was out there understood the fundamental impossibility of its presence. The words implied consciousness, awareness of the barrier between inside and outside, between possible and impossible. The fogging suddenly intensified, covering the entire southern wall in opaque condensation. Then, pressed against the glass from outside, 2 distinct shapes appeared, elongated impressions at shoulder height, exactly where someone might lean against the surface for support. Someone standing in empty air, leaning casually against a 7th-floor window. I backed away from the glass, my rational mind finally surrendering to pure terror. This wasn't hallucination or sleep deprivation. Something was out there. Something that existed in spaces where existence should be impossible. Something that wanted to communicate with me through a barrier of glass and physics and sanity. The shoulder impressions remained visible as the rest of the fogging began to fade. They looked disturbingly permanent, as if whatever had made them possessed substance enough to leave lasting marks. I fled the walkway again, but not before noticing that my phone had stopped recording. Not because the battery had died, but because the file had somehow corrupted, leaving only static where the tapping sounds should have been. Sleep became elusive. Every small sound in my room sent adrenaline flooding through my system. I found myself checking the door's lock obsessively, peering through the curtains at the street below, searching for impossible figures suspended in midair. The rational explanations I'd relied upon crumbled under the weight of accumulated evidence. The 5th night, I made a decision that even now seems like madness. I would confront whatever was haunting the walkway. I would lie on the glass and wait, and when it came, when the tapping began and the face appeared, I would not flee. I would force a resolution, demand answers from whatever existed in the space between worlds. I positioned myself in the walkway, armed with nothing but determination and a desperate need for closure. The aurora was particularly active, cascading sheets of green and blue that should have been beautiful, but felt ominous, as if the lights themselves were part of whatever was happening. The tapping began almost immediately. Tap, 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 tap. I didn't move, didn't reach for a flashlight or phone. I simply lay still and listened. Tap, tap, tap. The response came as expected, but this time, I tapped back. 5 deliberate strikes of my knuckles against the glass floor. The sound echoed through the walkway, mixing with the building's ambient vibrations. The external tapping ceased immediately. In the silence that followed, I felt the weight of attention focusing on me. The sensation was almost physical, a pressure against my skin that made my nerve endings sing with electricity. Something was evaluating me, deciding whether I was worthy of direct contact. The face appeared without warning, suddenly pressed against the northern wall, closer than before. The features were clearer now, distinctly human but wrong in subtle ways that made my brain struggle to process the image. The skin looked translucent, veined with patterns that might have been frost, or might have been something else entirely. The eyes were the worst part, completely aware, filled with an intelligence that recognized my presence and found it fascinating. This time, the face didn't disappear quickly. It remained pressed against the glass, studying me as I studied it. I realized with growing horror that it was trying to communicate not through tapping or breath writing, but through direct eye contact. Those dark hollows were attempting to convey information that existed beyond language, beyond the normal channels of human communication. The message, when it came, didn't arrive through my ears or eyes. It formed directly in my consciousness, like a thought that wasn't mine. The glass is thinner than you know. I understood, with terrible clarity, that the walkway wasn't just suspended between two buildings. It was suspended between realities, existing in a liminal space where the normal rules of physics and existence grew negotiable. Whatever was out there wasn't violating the laws of nature. It was occupying a space where those laws held less authority. The face began to change, features shifting as if viewed through disturbed water. The mouth opened, and though no sound penetrated the glass, I could see it forming words. Let me in. The request hit me like vertigo. The thing outside wasn't just observing, it was seeking entry. The tapping, the breath marks, the shoulder impressions were all attempts to weaken the barrier between its space and mine. Every night I'd spent in the walkway, I'd been participating in some kind of negotiation, unknowingly giving permission for the boundary to thin. I scrambled backward, but the face followed my movement, sliding along the glass as if it were floating in a medium that allowed impossible mobility. The features became more defined, more human, and I realized with mounting dread that it was mimicking me, adopting my facial structure, my expressions, becoming a reflection that existed on the wrong side of the mirror. You came looking for lights in the sky, the not voice whispered in my mind. But the most beautiful lights are the ones that come looking for you. The aurora overhead began to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, and I understood that the northern lights had never been the real attraction. They were just a lure, drawing people to spaces where the boundaries grew thin enough for things to push through from elsewhere. The face pressed closer to the glass, and I saw hairline cracks beginning to form in the surface. The barrier was weakening under the pressure of sustained contact. Whatever was out there was finally making real progress toward breaking through. I ran. Back to my room, door locked, curtains drawn. But I could still feel the presence outside, no longer confined to the walkway. It had tasted the possibility of entry and wouldn't abandon the pursuit. Every reflection, in the bathroom mirror, in the dark window, in the surface of water in a glass, might now hide the wrong face looking back. I left Iceland the next morning, changing my flight without explanation. The hotel staff seemed unsurprised by my early departure, and the receptionist's knowing smile suggested I wasn't the first guest to flee the walkway before completing their stay. But escape isn't possible when you've become the thing being hunted. The face I saw pressed against that glass follows me now, appearing in unexpected reflections, always just out of direct sight. It's still trying to communicate, still seeking entry to this side of whatever barrier separates us. And sometimes, in the early morning hours when sleep eludes me, I catch myself tapping patterns against windows. 5 taps, then 3, as if I'm the one trying to break through to the other side. As if the thing that wanted in has somehow gotten in after all, and now it's me who exists in the wrong world. Me who's pressing against the glass from the outside, desperately seeking a way back to where I belong. The glass between worlds, I've learned, is thinner than any of us know, and once you've seen through it, you can never be certain which side you're really on. Story 7. The message came through while I was 3 blocks from home, the phone buzzing against my thigh with an urgency that made my stomach tighten before I even read it. Dude, someone's in your room. Saw the blinds move twice. We're waiting outside. My keys felt foreign in suddenly slick palms as I quickened my pace, the familiar weight of routine shattered by 7 words that shouldn't make sense. The afternoon sun cast everything in sharp relief, each crack in the sidewalk, each shadow pooling beneath parked cars, each detail hyper-real in the way moments become when something fundamental shifts beneath your feet. I'd forgotten about the trip entirely. 3 days planned up north, bags packed since Tuesday, friends scheduled to collect me at 4:30 sharp. It was 4:47 when I turned the corner and saw their car idling outside my building, exhaust visible in the cooling air. They climbed out as I approached, faces carrying that particular tension people wear when they're trying not to alarm you while being thoroughly alarmed themselves. The taller one, I'd known him since college, but his name felt distant now, unimportant, gestured toward my second-floor window. "Twice," he repeated, voice careful and measured, like someone checking to see if we were still here. I followed his gaze upward. The window looked exactly as it always did, blinds closed, no movement, no sign of disturbance. The building's brick facade absorbed the late afternoon light, giving nothing back. "You sure?" I asked, though something cold was already spreading through my chest. "Dead sure. First time around 4:30, then again maybe 10 minutes later. Deliberate, you know, like fingers just parting them." The space between my shoulder blades prickled. I'd been at the hardware store exactly 20 minutes, grabbing sandpaper for a weekend project that now seemed as distant as childhood. 20 minutes during which someone had been inside my home, moving through my space, touching my things. Except the electronic lock showed no signs of tampering when I examined it, the metal surface unmarked, the LED still blinking its steady green. I punched in the code with fingers that wanted to tremble, half expecting resistance. But the mechanism clicked open with its usual precision. The alarm panel beeped its familiar welcome, displaying the time I'd armed it, 4:09 p.m. No alerts, no warnings, no indication that anyone had crossed the motion sensors scattered throughout the apartment. The system had been undisturbed for the entire 20 minutes of my absence. But systems could be wrong. Technology failed. There were explanations. "I need to check something," I told them, my voice sounding strange in the enclosed hallway. They offered to come with me, but I needed this moment alone, needed to understand what was happening, without their worried faces reflecting my own growing unease. The apartment felt normal as I moved through it. Too normal, perhaps, like a stage set waiting for actors. Nothing out of place, nothing missing, every object exactly where I'd left it. But there was something else, something I couldn't name, a sense that the air itself had been disturbed, molecules rearranged by the passage of someone who shouldn't exist. My laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, still displaying the security camera feeds from throughout the apartment. 3 cameras total: living room, hallway, and bedroom. I'd installed them after a break-in 2 buildings over, more for peace of mind than any real expectation of need. Now I scrolled back through the footage with hands that wanted to shake. 4:27 p.m. Nothing. 4:31 p.m. A slight change in the bedroom feed that made me pause and rewind. The frame showed my bedroom exactly as I'd left it, but something was different about the light. A thin strip of afternoon sun that normally fell across the hardwood floor near the window. It was angled differently. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely different. I checked the sensor data logged by the smart home system. At 4:31:17, the bedroom's light sensor had registered a sudden drop, falling from 847 lux to 723 lux in the span of 2 seconds, then climbing back to 851 lux by 4:31:31. 14 seconds of changed light. 14 seconds during which something had interrupted the sun's path through my bedroom window. But the camera showed no movement, no person, no disturbance of any kind. Just the subtle shift of that light strip on the floor, as if the blinds had been parted and released, but accomplished by invisible hands. I sat staring at the screen until the numbers began to blur, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The sensor didn't lie. Something had blocked the light, but the camera showed nothing. How do you block light without being there? How do you move blinds without existing? The second incident happened at 4:34:22. Same pattern. Light sensor dropping, climbing, the strip on the floor shifting its angle. But this time, I noticed something else. The camera's automatic exposure had adjusted to compensate for the changing light levels, and in that brief adjustment, the image had flickered slightly. In that flicker, for perhaps a single frame, I thought I saw something. A darker area near the window that hadn't been there before and wasn't there after. Like a shadow cast by nothing, or the absence of something that should have been present. I called down to my friends that everything was fine, that I'd be ready in 5 minutes. My voice echoed strangely in the stairwell, bouncing back with unfamiliar resonances. They accepted this with visible relief, eager to begin the trip and leave the afternoon strangeness behind. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I downloaded the footage to my phone, then spent the drive north obsessively reviewing those few seconds, watching the light change, watching the shadow that might not have been a shadow. My friends chatted about weekend plans and work frustrations, their voices becoming background noise to the growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of what was possible. The cabin they'd rented sat beside a lake that reflected the sky like polished metal. We grilled food and played cards and tried to enjoy the kind of casual male bonding that had come easily in college, but required more effort now. I participated, laughed at jokes, contributed to conversations, all while that footage played on endless loop in my mind. Sunday night, back in the city, I installed additional sensors. Motion detectors with smartphone alerts, another camera aimed specifically at the bedroom window, temperature sensors that would register even the slightest change in air circulation. I told myself it was precautionary, reasonable, the kind of thing anyone would do after such an experience. But I also found myself checking the feeds constantly. During meetings at work, I'd pull up the app, scanning the empty rooms of my apartment for signs of change. At lunch, walking to the subway, lying in bed, the cameras became a constant presence, electronic eyes watching my space while I couldn't. The apartment remained undisturbed for 4 days. Then, Thursday evening at 6:17 p.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I was in a coffee shop 6 blocks away reviewing quarterly reports while rain drummed against the windows. The alert showed the bedroom camera, and at first glance everything appeared normal. The usual view: bed, dresser, window with blinds closed, the strip of early evening light falling across the floor at its familiar angle. But the motion sensor had been triggered by something. I watched the timestamp roll forward. 6:17:43, 6:17:44, 6:17:45. Nothing moved in the frame. Nothing changed. Yet the sensor insisted something was there, something significant enough to register movement. Then, at 6:17:52, I saw it. The window reflected the street outside, a common effect when the light inside was dimmer than the light without. Headlights, building facades, the occasional pedestrian, all ghosted onto the glass surface like a dim television screen. I'd noticed this reflection countless times before without giving it much thought. But now, watching intently, I saw the reflection shift. It was subtle, barely perceptible. The reflected streetlights seemed to flicker, not in the random way of electrical fluctuation, but with deliberate rhythm. And then, moving across that reflected surface, a dark shape passed from right to left. At first I thought it must be someone walking past my window from the outside, but I was on the second floor. No one could walk past my bedroom window without a ladder or wings. And the shape was wrong anyway. Too fluid, too undefined, like smoke given temporary form. The motion alert ended at 6:18:03. 11 seconds of what? Movement where none should be possible? A reflection of something that wasn't there? I left the coffee shop immediately, rain soaking through my jacket as I half-jogged the 6 blocks home. The building's lobby felt overheated after the cool night air, and the elevator's familiar mechanical sound seemed unnaturally loud. By the time I reached my door, adrenaline had sharpened every sense to painful acuity. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it, door locked, alarm armed, no signs of disturbance. But standing in my bedroom, looking at that window, I felt watched. Not the vague paranoia of an overactive imagination, but the specific, undeniable sensation of being observed by something with intelligence and intent. I pulled up the footage on my laptop, watching those 11 seconds over and over. The reflected shape appeared in frame 52, a darkness that seemed to absorb rather than block light, moving with purpose across the ghosted streetscape. In frame 73, it was gone, leaving behind only the normal reflection of the street outside. But there was something else. In the moment, just before the shape disappeared. The reflection itself seemed to invert briefly. The light areas becoming dark, the dark areas becoming light, as if reality had hiccuped, as if the world outside my window had been replaced, for just an instant, with its photographic negative. I called the building's security company, asked if they'd had any reports of someone on the fire escape, anyone seen near the second-floor windows. The night guard checked the exterior cameras but found nothing unusual. No ladder, no person, no explanation for what I'd seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the building, the expansion of heating pipes, the settling of wooden beams, the distant hum of the elevator, seemed magnified, threatening. I found myself listening not just to the sounds themselves, but to the spaces between them, convinced that something was moving through those gaps, existing in the pauses between one moment and the next. At 3:47 a.m., I was still awake when the bedroom's light sensor registered another change. This time, I was watching the feed live. The room appeared completely normal, untouched, exactly as it had looked moments before. But the sensor readings showed the light dropping, just as it had that first afternoon. And in the live feed, I watched that strip of light on the floor angle slightly, as if the blinds had been parted. But nothing was moving. Nothing was there. Nothing. I stood up from my desk chair, walked the few steps to the bedroom, stood directly beside the window. The blinds were closed, undisturbed. No hand touched them, no breeze moved them. Yet the light sensor continued to fluctuate, and on my phone screen, I could see the strip of light on the floor continuing to shift and dance. I was looking directly at the blinds while watching them move on camera. They weren't moving, but they were moving. The contradiction should have been impossible, but there it was, playing out in real time. Reality and its electronic representation showing two different versions of the same moment. Which one was true? Which one could I trust? I reached out to touch the blinds, and my hand passed through empty air 3 inches before making contact with the actual slats. For that brief moment, I felt the gap between where things were and where they appeared to be, a space that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. The realization hit me like cold water. I wasn't just being watched. I was being shown something. Someone, or something, was demonstrating the malleability of perception, the unreliability of what we call real. The cameras weren't malfunctioning. They were revealing a truth that my eyes refused to see. Over the following weeks, the incidents became more frequent. Light sensors registering impossible changes. Motion detectors triggered by nothing visible. Reflections that showed things that weren't there, or failed to show things that were. I began to understand that I was living between realities, the one my senses reported, and the one the electronics revealed. And in that gap, something else was moving, something that existed in the spaces between what is and what appears to be. I stopped trying to explain it to friends, stopped looking for rational solutions. The footage spoke for itself, if you knew how to watch it. If you understood that sometimes the camera sees more truly than the eye. Now I live with the knowledge that my apartment is not entirely mine, that something shares this space, moving through dimensions I can barely perceive. It parts my blinds without touching them, walks past my window without being there, exists in the reflection without casting it. And late at night, when the sensors register changes I cannot see, when the light shifts without source, when shadows move independently of the objects that should cast them, I no longer ask whether it's real. I ask instead, which version of real am I experiencing right now? And in this moment, does the distinction even matter? The cameras keep watching. The sensors keep recording. And somewhere between the digital truth and the analog lie, something continues to move, patient and purposeful, in the space where certainty ends and possibility begins. I've stopped planning trips. I've stopped leaving the apartment for long periods. Because now I understand, it's not about someone being in my space when I'm gone. It's about something being in my space that was always there, but only becomes visible when I'm not looking directly at it. The question isn't whether I'm losing my mind. The question is whether what I call sanity was ever an accurate way of seeing the world at all. Story 8. The first time it happened, I blamed the stress of the move. Dallas in October holds on to summer's heat like a desperate lover, and our industrial loft trapped every degree of it between its exposed brick walls. The building management called it authentic urban living, but what they meant was poor ventilation and paper-thin walls that let every sound from the street crawl up 3 stories to nest in our converted space. My sister found the place through some app that promised luxury for half the downtown price. The catch was always in what they didn't mention, like how the freight elevator groaned like something dying, or how the hallway lights flickered in sequences that reminded you of Morse code. We'd been roommates out of necessity more than choice. After the layoffs at the tech company where we both worked, her in marketing, me in development, splitting rent became survival rather than convenience. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that we'd grown up desperate to escape each other, only to end up sharing 4 walls again at 28 and 31. But necessity makes strange allies of blood relations, and besides, our schedules barely overlapped. She worked the morning shift at a boutique fitness studio downtown, rising at 4:30 and asleep by 9. I'd landed freelance work that kept me coding until the early hours, sleeping until noon when the Texas sun finally forced itself through our industrial windows. The arrangement worked perfectly until it didn't. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday morning at 3:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd been debugging a particularly stubborn piece of code when the weight settled onto my chest. Not like sleep paralysis. I'd experienced that before. The familiar terror of consciousness trapped in an unresponsive body. This was different. This was deliberate. The pressure started light, almost gentle, like someone testing the give of a mattress before committing their full weight. Then it increased incrementally, each moment bringing a few more pounds, a few more square inches of contact. What disturbed me most wasn't the weight itself, but the methodical way it applied itself. Patient, measured, as if whatever was responsible was conducting an experiment. The sensation around my throat came next. Not choking, nothing so crude or violent. Instead, it felt like the careful placement of fingers, testing pressure points with scientific precision. The kind of touch that suggested knowledge, anatomy textbook knowledge perhaps, or something learned through repetition. The pressure would increase until I reached the edge of panic, then release just enough to let me breathe. Over and over, like a lesson being taught or a skill being practiced. When I finally managed to fumble for the bedside lamp, my hand trembling more than I wanted to admit, the light revealed nothing unusual. The room looked exactly as it should. My laptop still open on the desk, the pile of clean laundry I'd been promising myself to put away, the half-empty water glass catching the amber glow. But something was wrong with the shadows. The light should have pushed them back, sent them retreating to the corners where they belonged. Instead, they seemed to deepen, pooling in places they had no business gathering. And there, just beyond the reach of my peripheral vision, 2 perfect circles of darkness hung suspended in the air. Not floating exactly. That would imply movement, buoyancy. These were simply there, as if they'd always been there, as if I'd only just learned how to see them properly. I lay frozen for 20 minutes, afraid to move, afraid to look directly at the spaces where I knew something was wrong. When I finally worked up the courage to turn my head, the circles were gone. Just empty air and the normal interplay of light and shadow that belonged in a room lit by a single bulb. The next morning I found the couch cushion dented in a way that made no sense. The indentation was precise, located exactly where someone's head would rest if they were lying down, but it was positioned at the wrong end of the sofa, where the arm curved up, as if someone had been lying there, head tilted back, practicing the arch that would expose their throat. The fabric held the impression perfectly, the memory foam still compressed hours after whatever had created it. I told myself it was nothing. New apartment, new stresses, new sounds filtering up from the street. The mind creates patterns where none exist, finds threats in empty spaces. But the rational explanations felt thin, inadequate covers for something that refused to be reasoned away. The second incident happened 4 days later. Same time, same methodical approach, But this time I was ready. I'd positioned my phone on the nightstand, recording app queued, and waiting. The weight settled onto me with that familiar patience, and I managed to activate the recording despite the tremor in my fingers. This time I tried to speak. The words felt strange in my throat, shaped wrong by the pressure that wasn't quite there. But I got them out, a whispered request for whoever was listening, on the phone, in the room, in whatever space existed between certainty and doubt, to hear what was happening to me. The pressure on my throat intensified immediately, as if responding to my voice. Not punishing, exactly, but correcting. Teaching me the proper volume, the appropriate tone. 3 distinct clicks echoed in the room, not from my phone, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that shouldn't produce sound. Electronic clicks, like a device powering on, or like joints popping in sequence. When I played back the recording the next morning, my voice sounded normal. Clear, calm, unremarkable. The clicks were there, unmistakable, but separated from my words by several seconds of silence. As if whatever had made them had been listening, processing, deciding how to respond. I started researching the building's history, digging through city records and property transfers. The structure had been built in the 1920s as a textile warehouse, converted to artist studios in the 70s, then gradually transitioned to residential lofts as the neighborhood gentrified. Nothing unusual in the records, no tragic accidents or mysterious disappearances. Just the ordinary progression of urban development, spaces repurposed and repurposed again as the city's needs evolved. But there were gaps in the documentation, periods where the building sat empty, where ownership transferred between shell companies with no clear connection to actual people. Times when the city lost track of what was happening within those brick walls. The incidents began occurring more frequently. Every few nights at first, then nightly, then sometimes twice in the same evening. The routine never varied. The weight, the pressure, the careful testing of limits. But the duration increased each time, stretching from minutes to half hours, until I began to dread sunset and the inevitable approach of 3 a.m. My sister noticed the changes before I did. The dark circles under my eyes, the way I jumped when she entered a room, the obsessive checking of locks and windows that served no real purpose in a third-floor apartment. She asked careful questions, the kind designed to sound casual while probing for signs of breakdown or substance abuse. I gave careful answers, equally designed to sound normal while revealing nothing that would prompt the kind of concern that led to interventions. But she knew something was wrong. Siblings develop radar for each other's distress, calibrated by years of shared space and mutual irritation. She started staying up later, finding reasons to be in the common areas when she should have been sleeping. Protective instincts disguised as insomnia. One night, she was reading on the couch when it happened. I heard her book close, heard her breathing change to the shallow rhythm of someone pretending to sleep. From my bedroom, I could see the faint glow of her phone screen as she held it beneath the coffee table, recording. The weight settled onto me with its usual precision, but something was different this time. The presence felt agitated, aware of the additional witness. The pressure on my throat increased more rapidly than usual, less patient with the gradual approach. And for the first time, I heard something that might have been breathing, not my own, which had become ragged with fear, but something measured and deliberate, coming from the space directly above my face. I tried to call out to my sister, but the pressure made it impossible. The sound that emerged was barely a whisper, more air than voice. But she heard it. I heard her move from the couch, heard her footsteps cross the hardwood floor, heard her pause outside my bedroom door. The weight vanished instantly. When she knocked and entered, I was sitting up in bed, fully alert, trying to control my breathing. She studied my face in the dim light from the hallway, taking inventory of pupils and skin tone and the 1,000 small signs that might indicate drugs or hallucination or breakdown. The next morning, she played me her recording. 43 minutes of nothing. No sounds, no movement, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Just the ambient noise of the building settling and the distant hum of traffic from the street below. But she'd heard something. She was sure of it. We started talking in careful circles around the subject, neither willing to state directly what we suspected. She mentioned feeling watched in the apartment, the way the shadows seemed to move independently of their light sources. I described the way certain spaces felt occupied even when they were clearly empty, the sensation of walking through invisible cobwebs that clung to exposed skin. Neither of us slept well anymore. The incidents continued, but now they felt performative, as if they were being conducted for an audience of two instead of one. The weight would settle, the pressure would build, but something else had entered the routine. I began to sense movement in the room during these episodes. Not visible movement, but displacement of air, the subtle changes in acoustic space that indicated the presence of something solid. And the cushion on the sofa began showing new impressions. Not just the head-shaped dent at the wrong end, but handprints on the arms, the suggestion of a full body stretched across the cushions in an impossible position, as if someone was learning to inhabit the space more completely, studying the furniture like a stage set. My sister started sleeping with her bedroom door locked. I started sleeping with mine open, afraid that closed doors might trap me with whatever was conducting its nightly experiments. We developed a system of signals, text messages at regular intervals, coded phrases that indicated safety or distress, the kind of communication network you'd expect from people living under siege. But siege implies an external enemy, a threat that originates somewhere outside the walls you're defending. What we were experiencing felt more intimate than that, more integrated into the space we thought we controlled. It wasn't invasion, it was cohabitation. The breakthrough came on a Saturday night when the freelance work had finally given me a reason to stay awake past 3 a.m. I was deep in code when I heard the distinctive sound of the couch creaking in the living room. Not the random settling of furniture, but the rhythmic compression of someone getting comfortable, adjusting their position, finding the right angle. I approached the living room carefully, avoiding the floorboards that I'd learned would announce my presence. The space was dark except for the city lights filtering through the large windows, casting everything in amber and shadow. But I could see the couch clearly, could see the way the cushions compressed and released in a pattern that suggested breathing. As I watched, the impression deepened at the head of the couch, right where the arm curved up. The fabric stretched as if accommodating weight, held the position for a moment, then relaxed. Then it happened again and again, each repetition lasting a few seconds longer than the last. I stood there for 20 minutes, watching the invisible rehearsal. Someone was learning to be comfortable in that position, learning to maintain it for extended periods. Someone was practicing. When I finally returned to my bedroom, the weight settled onto my chest immediately. But this time, instead of the usual methodical increase of pressure, it felt almost eager, as if the practice session had been preparation for improved performance. The pressure around my throat was more confident now, more certain of exactly how much force to apply and for how long. And for the first time, I felt the unmistakable sensation of breath against my face. Warm, measured, human. I stopped trying to document the incidents. My sister stopped asking questions. We developed an unspoken agreement that some experiences resist explanation, that the attempt to quantify or record them might be more dangerous than simply enduring them. We coexisted with our invisible roommate, learning its schedule, adapting our routines to accommodate its needs. But adaptation isn't acceptance. Every night, as I feel the familiar weight settle onto my chest and the careful pressure test the limits of my throat, I wonder what lesson is being taught, what skill is being perfected. I wonder what the point of all this practice might be, and when the real performance might begin. The cushion on the couch no longer returns to its original shape. The impression has become permanent, a perfect mold of someone's head tilted back at an impossible angle. Sometimes, late at night when the building is completely silent, I catch myself listening for breathing from the living room, for the sound of someone making themselves at home in the space they've claimed. I never hear it. But the cushion grows a little deeper each morning, as if the weight it supports increases gradually over time, as if someone is growing stronger, more substantial, more ready for whatever comes next. And every night at 3:47 a.m., the lessons continue. Story 9. The Carpenter Theater hasn't hosted a proper performance in 18 months, but every night I sweep the same dust from the same seats, collect the same scattered programs, and check the same doors that somehow always need checking again. The building breathes differently when empty. Each creak of settling wood sounds deliberate, purposeful, as if the theater is trying to tell me something I'm not quite bright enough to understand. I've been the night custodian here for 3 years now, ever since the city took over the building and decided it needed someone to keep watch over Richmond's architectural treasure. The job pays decent for what it is. 6 hours alone with mops and vacuum cleaners, making sure nothing gets stolen or damaged while the city council debates whether to renovate or sell. Most nights pass without incident. Most nights, the only sounds are my footsteps on worn carpeting and the occasional settling of century-old timber. But there's this one thing, this one strange, persistent thing that's been happening for the past 6 weeks. Every morning when I arrive, I find a program from the theater's last season folded neatly on seat 12G, dead center of the house, 7 rows back from the stage. Always the same program, Macbeth, March 2023, always folded the same way, creased down the middle with the edges aligned perfectly, always placed as if someone sat down, unfolded it to read, then folded it back and left it there when the show ended. The first few times I figured it was just some piece of paper that kept getting blown around by the ventilation system, landing in the same spot by coincidence. I'd pick it up, throw it in my trash bag, and think nothing more about it. But the program kept reappearing. Same seat, same fold, same placement. After 2 weeks of this, I started paying closer attention. The paper isn't yellowed or worn despite being handled repeatedly. The printing is still sharp, colors still vivid. More unsettling is how it's positioned. Not carelessly dropped or blown there by air currents, but placed with the deliberate care of someone saving their spot during intermission. Someone who intended to return. I began checking that seat first thing every night, documenting when I found the program and when I removed it. Every single shift, there it was. I started photographing it with my phone, noting the exact angle, the way it sat against the burgundy velvet cushion. The consistency was unnerving. Whatever was placing it there, wind, gravity, some elaborate prank, was remarkably precise. 3 weeks ago, I decided to leave it alone. Maybe if I stopped removing it, stopped disrupting whatever pattern was causing this, the whole thing would resolve itself. The program stayed put for my entire shift that night. When I returned the following evening, it was still there, but something felt different about the seat itself. The cushion looked depressed, as if someone had been sitting in it for hours. The armrests bore the subtle warmth of recent contact. I told myself the theater's heating system was acting up, creating warm spots throughout the building. Old buildings do that. Steam radiators and ancient ductwork can create all sorts of temperature irregularities. But when I pressed my palm against the neighboring seats, they were cool to the touch. Only 12G held any warmth. That's when I started noticing the cold. 2 weeks ago, during my usual sweep of the orchestra section, I felt it for the first time. A rectangular patch of frigid air about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, hovering exactly 1 yard from the end of row 12. The temperature drop was sharp and defined, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. Outside this invisible boundary, the theater maintained its normal stuffiness. Inside, my breath misted and my skin prickled with goosebumps. I grabbed a thermometer from the maintenance closet and took readings. The cold rectangle registered 15 degrees lower than the surrounding air. The edges were knife-sharp. I could move my hand in and out of the space and feel the temperature change instantly. No gradual transition, no blending with the warmer air around it. Just a perfectly defined box of cold, hanging in space like a held breath. The rational part of my mind cataloged possible explanations. Air conditioning malfunction, drafts from hidden vents, thermal layering caused by the building's heating system. But when I checked the next night, the cold rectangle had moved. It now hovered near the center aisle, still maintaining that precise 3x6 dimension, still 15 degrees colder than everything around it. As I swept that section, moving methodically down the rows, the rectangle seemed to drift along with me, keeping pace like a well-trained dog staying at heel. I stopped sweeping, The rectangle stopped moving. I resumed. It resumed. For 20 minutes, I tested this phenomenon, walking back and forth across the orchestra section with my push broom, and that invisible block of cold air followed me everywhere. Never getting closer than a yard, never falling behind, just accompanying me, watching my work. The following night, I tried a different approach. Instead of sweeping, I used the vacuum cleaner, working in a completely different pattern than usual. The cold rectangle adapted immediately, positioning itself along my new route, maintaining its respectful distance while I cleaned. By the fourth night of this, I developed a theory that felt simultaneously logical and insane. Something was following me, something invisible that displaced air temperatures and left depressions in theater seats. Something that had claimed seat 12G as its regular spot and now felt compelled to supervise my work. I started talking to it. "You can come closer if you want," I said during my fifth night of being followed. "I'm just doing my job here, not trying to bother anyone." The cold rectangle maintained its distance. "Used to come to shows here, did you? Before they shut down?" No response, but I swore I could feel attention focused on me, the weight of invisible eyes tracking my movements. That's when I remembered the man in the coat. It had happened the night before I first noticed the cold rectangle, but I dismissed it as a trick of lighting and fatigue. I was finishing up in the orchestra section when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A figure standing near the stage door, partially obscured by shadows. When I turned to look directly, I saw a man in what appeared to be an old-fashioned dress coat, the kind worn to formal events decades ago. He was holding something in his raised hand, a piece of paper that looked torn. In the dim work lights, I couldn't make out his features clearly, but I could see enough to know he didn't belong there. The stage door was locked from the inside, had been locked since I'd checked it an hour earlier. No one could have entered without me hearing. "Excuse me," I'd called out. "The theater is closed." Instead of answering, the figure had moved toward the central section of seats. Not walked, but glided, feet never seeming to touch the floor. He'd moved with purpose, as if he knew exactly where he was going, and stopped at the end of row 12. When he turned toward me, I should have been able to see his face clearly under the work lights, but somehow couldn't. The features refused to resolve, like trying to focus on something seen through water. Then I'd hit the main light switches, flooding the entire space with harsh fluorescent illumination. The figure was gone. No sign he'd ever been there, no echo of footsteps, no disturbance in the dust patterns on the floor, just that lingering cold where he'd been standing, concentrated and sharp-edged. I'd convinced myself it was a hallucination brought on by long hours and poor lighting. Fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. But now, with this cold rectangle following me night after night, I wasn't so sure. Tonight marks 2 weeks since I first noticed my invisible companion. I've developed a routine around it, sweeping in patterns that accommodate its presence, talking to it quietly as I work. The one-sided conversations help me feel less crazy, though I'm not sure how successful that effort has been. "You're getting bolder," I observed tonight as I worked through the mezzanine section. The cold rectangle had positioned itself closer than usual, maybe 2 feet away instead of its customary yard. "Starting to trust me?" As I spoke, I felt something brush against my arm. Not a physical touch, but a pressure change, as if someone had reached toward me and stopped just short of contact. The fine hairs on my forearm stood up. I paused in my sweeping and turned toward the space where I knew it was hovering. "You were here for the last show, weren't you? Macbeth, March 2023, seat 12G. The temperature in the cold rectangle seemed to drop even further. My breath began to fog. "You still have your ticket, don't you? That's what you were holding when I saw you. Half a ticket, torn down the middle." The cold pressed closer, and I felt that almost touch again, stronger this time. A sensation like fingers passing through the air near my shoulder. "You can't leave, can you?" The response came not as words, but as a shift in the atmosphere around me. The theater's usual background sounds, settling wood, distant traffic, the building's mechanical systems, faded to absolute silence. Even my own breathing seemed muffled. In that quiet, I heard something that made my skin crawl. The faint rustle of paper being unfolded. I looked toward seat 12G and the program was there, lying open across the armrest, pages spread wide as if someone had just finished reading through it. The paper moved slightly, edges lifting as if stirred by a breeze that touched nothing else in the theater. "The show must go on," I whispered, not sure why those particular words came to mind. The program's pages turned by themselves, slowly, deliberately, as if invisible hands were reading every word, studying every advertisement and cast list and production note. When it reached the final page, the paper folded itself neatly back to its familiar crease and settled into place. The cold rectangle moved away from me then, drifting toward row 12 and positioning itself directly in front of seat 12G. I followed at a respectful distance, pushing my broom but no longer pretending to work. As I approached, I could see the seat more clearly than ever before. The burgundy velvet cushion bore a clear depression, shaped exactly like someone sitting upright with proper posture. The armrests showed wear patterns where hands might rest during a long performance. Most unsettling of all, I could see the faint outline of breath condensation on the seatback's fabric, a ghostly impression of someone leaning back to enjoy the show. The cold rectangle settled into the space in front of the seat and became perfectly still. I stood there for a long moment, gripping my broom handle and trying to process what I was seeing. A seat that had been occupied by the same invisible presence for 6 weeks. A program that returned every night like a held reservation. A cold spot that followed me around like a concerned patron making sure I was doing good work. "You're not ready to go home yet," I said finally. The condensation on the seat back grew more pronounced, as if whoever was sitting there had just exhaled deeply. "The theater closed, but you stayed for the whole run, didn't you? Even after the lights went out and everyone else left." I thought about the torn ticket, the half that remained, an incomplete admission, a story without an ending. "You only saw half the show." The program on the armrest fluttered open again, pages turning faster now, agitated. The cold rectangle began moving restlessly, drifting back and forth in front of the seat like someone pacing. Understanding hit me with a chill that had nothing to do with supernatural temperatures. The figure in the coat, the program that returned every night, the cold presence that supervised my work. It wasn't malevolent. It wasn't even trying to frighten me. It was waiting for the theater to open again, waiting for the lights to dim and the curtain to rise, waiting to see how Macbeth ended, because something had interrupted that final performance, and the story remained unfinished. I looked around the empty theater, at the dark stage and the silent seats and the cold rectangle hovering in front of 12G, like a question that needed answering. The building itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do with this knowledge. "I can't bring back the actors," I told the invisible presence. "Can't restart the show." The cold rectangle moved closer to me again, and I felt that almost touch on my arm, more insistent now, pleading. I set down my broom and approached seat 12G slowly. The program lay open on the armrest, pages stirring in a breeze that existed only in the space immediately around the chair. As I got closer, I could feel the cold more intensely, but also something else, a sense of desperate hope, as if whatever was sitting there believed I might have an answer. "The show closed," I said gently. "March 18th, 2023. Final performance. But you missed the ending, didn't you?" The pages of the program stopped moving. "You want to know how it ends?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I needed. The Richmond Community Players still had an active website, still maintained by volunteers who'd been involved with the theater's final season. The phone rang twice before a woman answered. "Hello?" "Hi. This is going to sound strange, but I'm the night custodian at the Carpenter Theater, and I need to ask you about the final performance of Macbeth in March 2023. "Oh." A pause. "Is this about the man who had the medical emergency?" My blood went cold. "Medical emergency?" "During the final scene. He was in the center section, maybe 7 or 8 rows back. Had some kind of episode. Heart attack, we think. The paramedics came, but, well, he didn't make it. We had to stop the show about 10 minutes before the end. The cold rectangle pressed closer to me, and I could feel a tension like a physical weight. Do you remember what seat he was in? Not exactly, but it was right in the middle. The ushers said he'd been coming to every performance that week, always sat in the same spot. Sweet old man. We never learned his name. I looked at the program in seat 12G, at the depression in the cushion, at the cold space hovering expectantly beside me. The show, I managed. How does Macbeth end? She told me. Act 5, Scene 8, the final duel between Macbeth and Macduff. The tyrant's death and Malcolm's restoration to the throne. The closing lines about healing Scotland's wounds and setting things right again. As she spoke, I watched the program's pages turn themselves to the final scene, following along with her words. The cold around me seemed to warm slightly, as if whatever had been causing it was finally, after 18 months, allowing itself to relax. Thank you, I said, and ended the call. The theater was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, peaceful rather than expectant. Complete. I looked down at the program one last time. The pages had settled on the final scene, showing the cast list and the closing lines of dialogue. As I watched, the paper began to fold itself, slowly and carefully, with the reverence of someone putting away a treasured memory. When the program was fully folded and placed neatly on the armrest, the cold rectangle began to dissipate. Not all at once, but gradually, like morning mist burning off in sunlight. The temperature around seat 12G warmed to match the rest of the theater. The depression in the cushion slowly filled out as if invisible weight was lifting away. Within minutes, there was no sign that anything unusual had ever happened in this section of the theater. Just an empty seat with a folded program resting on its arm, looking like it had been left there by an audience member who'd stepped out during intermission and simply never returned. I picked up the program and examined it one final time. The paper felt different now. Older, more fragile, as if it had finally been allowed to age properly. I slipped it into my shirt pocket and finished my rounds. The next morning, I arrived for my shift, expecting to find the program back in seat 12G as always, but the chair was empty. No program, no depression in the cushion, no residual warmth on the armrests. Just a regular theater seat waiting for the next show to begin. I still work nights at the Carpenter Theater, still sweep the same floors and check the same doors. The city council is finally moving forward with renovation plans, and there's talk of reopening as a community playhouse within the year. When that happens, I think I'll ask them to reserve seat 12G for the opening night performance. Not sell it, just leave it empty with a small placard. Reserved for a friend, because sometimes the most important audience members are the ones you never see, the ones who stay until the very end just to make sure the story gets told properly. And sometimes, if you're patient enough to listen, you can help them find the endings they're looking for. The cold rectangle never came back, but I still feel watched during my rounds. Not the desperate, needy attention of someone waiting for resolution, but the comfortable presence of someone who's found their peace and doesn't mind keeping an old custodian company while he works. Every now and then, usually on quiet nights when the building settles just right, I hear the faint rustle of papers being turned. But when I look toward the seats, they're all empty, exactly as they should be. And that's fine by me. Some stories are meant to be read in silence, in the spaces between one ending and the next beginning, where the real magic of theater lives on long after the curtain falls. Story 10. The jacket came back wrong. I should have known the moment I saw it folded on my bed that Tuesday morning, arms crossed like a corpse, the vintage brass pin gleaming against the black leather lapel. The pin I'd never seen before, an Art Deco sunburst with tiny scratches that caught the pale Seattle light filtering through my bedroom blinds. But relief flooded through me first, drowning out the voice in my head that whispered, "How?" 3 months. 3 months since the moving truck had disappeared into the gray maze of Interstate 5 with half my life inside it. including the jacket my father had given me before the cancer took his voice. The insurance claim sat in my kitchen drawer, stamped denied in red ink. The moving company had vanished like morning mist, and I'd accepted it all with the hollow resignation that comes from losing too much, too fast. Until that gray Sunday when I'd sat on my new couch in my half-empty apartment, staring at the rain streaking down the windows, and heard myself say it aloud. I'd trade anything to have it back. The right way. The words had fallen from my mouth like stones into still water, creating ripples I couldn't see. The apartment had gone quiet, not just silent, but quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. Even the refrigerator's hum had stopped, as if the whole building were holding its breath. Now the jacket lay before me, real as the floorboards beneath my bare feet. I lifted it carefully, expecting it to dissolve like a dream. The leather was supple under my fingers, unmarked by time or wear. But the smell hit me immediately. Old wood, dust, and something else. Something like the air inside an antique shop that's been closed too long, where the merchandise sits in darkness, waiting. The scent clung to the jacket like a living thing, following me to the bathroom mirror as I held it up against my chest. The fit was perfect, exactly as I remembered, but the reflection looking back felt wrong somehow. The jacket seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a dark void where my torso should be. I tried to shake off the feeling and hung it carefully in the closet, but the smell lingered. Over the following days, I found myself drawn to the jacket with an intensity that bordered on compulsion. Each morning, I'd wake to find myself thinking about it before my eyes were fully open. The scent had spread through the apartment, subtle but persistent, clinging to the walls and settling into the corners like dust. It reminded me of the estate sales my mother used to drag me to as a child. Rooms full of strangers' belongings, each piece carrying the weight of lives I'd never know. The first time the lights changed, I thought it was a power surge. I was walking past the hallway mirror, the one that came with the apartment, when the cold fluorescent bulbs overhead suddenly warmed, casting everything in golden light for exactly 3 seconds. The transformation was so complete that for a moment I could have sworn I was looking at a shop window display, myself as the mannequin in someone else's carefully arranged scene. When the lights returned to their harsh white reality, I stood there blinking, my reflection staring back with what looked like surprise. I checked the electrical panel, called the building manager, even tested the switch. Everything was normal. But it happened again the next day, and the next. Always when I passed the mirror. Always for exactly 3 seconds. Always that warm, inviting glow that made me feel like merchandise on display. I started avoiding the hallway, taking the long way around to the bathroom and bedroom. But the apartment seemed to be shrinking, funneling me toward that stretch of corridor whether I wanted to go there or not. The refrigerator I needed was in the kitchen, which meant passing the mirror. The front door required the same route. Even the bathroom called to me in the middle of the night, my bladder insisting on its needs while my feet carried me through that golden transformation again and again. The jacket watched from the closet. That sounds insane, I know. Jackets don't watch anything. They're leather and fabric and thread, nothing more. But I could feel it in there, patient and expectant, like a dog waiting for its walk. Sometimes I'd catch myself standing at the closet door, hand on the knob, with no memory of walking over. The brass pin would catch the light from inside the dark space, winking at me like a knowing eye. I wore it once, on a Thursday evening when the rain was drumming against the windows, and the apartment felt too quiet. The moment I slipped my arms through the sleeves, the scent enveloped me completely, and something shifted in the air. The walls seemed to draw back slightly, creating more space, more room to breathe. The harsh fluorescent lights throughout the apartment took on that warm golden tone, not just in the hallway, but everywhere. For 20 minutes, I felt like I was living inside a perfectly curated display, every detail arranged for maximum appeal. The throw pillow on my couch looked more expensive. My books seemed better organized. Even the dust motes in the air moved with deliberate grace. I was the featured item in this careful presentation, and somewhere out there, unseen customers were admiring the way I looked in their merchandise. When I took the jacket off, the illusion shattered like glass. The apartment returned to its original dimensions, the lights harsh and cold, the furniture suddenly shabby and wrong. I hung the jacket back in the closet and didn't touch it for 3 days, but I dreamed about it. Every night, the same dream. I was standing in a shop I'd never seen, surrounded by racks of identical leather jackets. A man with no face stood behind the counter, his hands folded. He never spoke, but I understood what he was saying. Everything has a price. Everything can be returned. But borrowing requires collateral. I'd wake with the taste of dust in my mouth and the certainty that something was moving through my apartment in the dark hours, rearranging things by millimeters, making tiny adjustments to improve the display. My toothbrush would be angled differently in its holder. Books would shift position on shelves. The coffee cup I'd left on the counter would migrate 3 inches to the left, positioned for better visual impact. Never anything dramatic, never anything I could point to and say definitively had been moved. Just small improvements to the overall presentation. I started leaving things in specific positions before bed, marking their locations with my phone's camera. In the morning, I'd compare the photos to reality. The differences were subtle but consistent. Everything shifted slightly toward greater aesthetic appeal, as if an invisible curator was making nightly rounds. The jacket hung silent and patient, but I began to feel like I was the one being worn. 2 weeks after it returned, I decided to research the brass pin. The Art Deco sunburst design looked expensive, possibly vintage. I photographed it from every angle and spent hours scouring online auction sites and antique databases. Nothing matched exactly, but I found similar pieces dating from the 1920s and 1930s, many from estate sales of people who'd worked in retail. Shop owners mostly, boutique managers, a few department store floor supervisors. All of them were described as having died alone, their personal effects sold to pay debts or settle estates. One listing mentioned that the original owner had been known for his unusual dedication to presentation, working 16-hour days arranging and rearranging displays until his health failed. I closed the laptop and tried to forget what I'd read, but the information burrowed into my mind like a tick. That night, the dream changed. Instead of the faceless man behind the counter, I saw myself in the mirror, but older, hollow-eyed, moving with the mechanical precision of someone who'd spent too long arranging things for other people's approval. When I woke, the apartment smelled stronger than ever. That thick, patient scent of a shop waiting for customers who never came. I decided to get rid of the jacket. The plan was simple: drive it to a thrift store across town, donate it, and walk away. I wouldn't even watch where they put it. Clean break, fresh start, return to normalcy. I pulled it from the closet on a Saturday morning, folded it carefully, and headed for my car. But when I reached for the door handle, my hand stopped. The thought of being separated from the jacket sent a wave of panic through me so intense I nearly vomited. It wasn't just reluctance. It was physical revulsion, as if I were contemplating cutting off a limb. The jacket felt warm in my arms, alive and necessary, and the idea of leaving it with strangers seemed not just wrong but dangerous. What if they didn't understand how to care for it? What if they damaged the brass pin or exposed it to harsh detergent? What if they sold it to someone who wouldn't appreciate its particular needs? I walked back to the closet and hung it up, my hands shaking. That afternoon, I called in sick to work and spent 6 hours researching leather care techniques. I ordered specialized cleaners and conditioners, soft bristle brushes, cedar hangers. The jacket deserved proper treatment. It had found its way back to me despite impossible odds. The least I could do was show some gratitude. The brass pin gleamed as if in approval. By the 3rd week, I'd established a routine. Every morning before work, I'd check on the jacket, ensuring it was hanging properly and hadn't been disturbed by the night's subtle rearrangements. Every evening when I returned, I'd spend a few minutes simply looking at it, appreciating the craftsmanship and the way it caught the light. On weekends, I'd take it out and brush it carefully, working the leather conditioner into every crease and fold. The apartment continued its nightly transformations, growing more sophisticated each day. My belongings seemed to arrange themselves with increasing precision, creating vignettes that were almost too perfect, too deliberate. I'd find my morning coffee positioned next to a carefully angled newspaper, my evening wine paired with an artfully opened book. Every surface became a small display, every corner a carefully curated scene. I should have been disturbed, but instead I felt proud. The apartment was becoming beautiful in ways I'd never managed on my own. Visitors would comment on my sudden talent for interior design, asking where I'd learned such an eye for composition. I'd just smile and say it had come naturally. The jacket hung in the closet like a conductor directing an invisible orchestra, and I was both musician and audience in its performance. But the dreams were getting worse. Now, I wasn't just standing in the shop. I was working there, endlessly rearranging the same displays while customers with no faces examined me from the other side of invisible glass. Their attention was suffocating, pressing against my skin like hot breath. I'd try to move out of their sight, but there was nowhere to go. Every corner of the shop was visible, every angle exposed to their silent scrutiny. I'd wake gasping, the sheets soaked in sweat, and spend the rest of the night pacing through my perfectly arranged apartment while the jacket watched from the closet, patient as a spider in its web. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in the 4th week. I'd fallen asleep on the couch while reading, and something woke me around 3 in the morning. The apartment was dark except for thin strips of streetlight bleeding through the blinds, but I could sense movement in the shadows. Subtle shifts in the air, the whisper of fabric against fabric, the soft scrape of objects being moved across surfaces. I lay perfectly still, eyes closed, listening to my belongings being rearranged with obsessive precision, a book sliding across the coffee table, the TV remote repositioned for better visual balance. My keys moved from one spot to another on the kitchen counter. Each adjustment was small, careful, deliberate, but what made my blood freeze was the sound that came with it. Breathing, low, controlled, professional breathing, like someone concentrating intensely on detailed work. The breath of a craftsman perfecting his art. I opened my eyes a fraction and saw him in the golden light that now emanated from every bulb in the apartment. He was tall and thin, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been tailored in the 1930s. His movements were economical and precise as he adjusted my belongings with the confidence of long practice. In the warm light, every surface gleamed like a shop window, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I was looking at a display in progress. He paused at the coffee table and tilted his head, considering the arrangement of my magazines. His profile was sharp and somehow familiar, though I was certain I'd never seen him before. After a moment, he made a minute adjustment to the magazine closest to the lamp, then stepped back to admire his work. That's when he noticed me watching. Our eyes met across the golden-lit room, and he smiled. A patient, proprietorial smile that acknowledged my presence without surprise. He'd been waiting for me to wake up, I realized. This moment was part of the display, too. He raised one finger to his lips in a gesture of silence, then pointed to the closet where the jacket hung. The brass pin caught the light and threw tiny reflections across the wall like stars. In that moment, I understood the nature of our arrangement. The jacket hadn't been returned. It had been loaned, along with the services of a caretaker who understood the importance of proper presentation. And I wasn't the customer in this transaction. I was the merchandise. The man in the antique suit nodded once, as if approving of my comprehension, then walked calmly toward the hallway mirror. As he approached, the golden light began to fade, returning my apartment to its normal harsh fluorescence. But just before the transformation completed, I saw his reflection change. Instead of the tall, thin man, the mirror showed my own face, but older, hollower, marked by the particular exhaustion that comes from a lifetime of arranging things for other people's satisfaction. The brass pin gleamed on my lapel, and my eyes held the patient, professional emptiness of someone who'd forgotten the difference between caretaker and product. The lights clicked back to cold white. The man was gone. The apartment was still. But in the morning I found new items I didn't remember buying. A vintage leather-bound notebook positioned perfectly on my nightstand, a brass letter opener arranged with geometric precision next to my computer, a small crystal paperweight that caught the light at exactly the right angle. Each piece bore tiny scratches, and the faint scent of old shops and patient waiting. I wear the jacket now every evening, walking past the hallway mirror and basking in those 3 seconds of golden warmth when I transform from tenant to display piece. The brass pin has been joined by others, small additions that appear overnight, each one improving my presentation, making me more appealing to the invisible customers who examine my life through windows I cannot see. The apartment rearranges itself with increasing confidence, creating ever more sophisticated displays. I've learned not to fight the changes, not to question the logic of objects that migrate in the night, or the way my belongings seem to anticipate needs I haven't yet expressed. Sometimes I catch glimpses of him in reflective surfaces, the tall man in his careful suit, nodding approvingly at his work. He never speaks, but I understand his satisfaction. The display is nearly perfect now, every element in its proper place, every detail arranged for maximum impact. I've stopped going to work. The outside world feels harsh and chaotic after the golden precision of my curated existence. Food appears in my refrigerator, bills are paid by mechanisms I no longer question, and my reflection grows more refined each day, shaped by invisible hands into something worthy of professional presentation. The jacket fits better now than it ever did when it was mine. The leather has molded to my shoulders with the patience of something that knows it has all the time in the world. The brass pin has multiplied into a small constellation across the lapel, each addition marking another level of completion. Tonight I dreamed I was both customer and merchandise, examining myself from the outside while feeling the weight of unseen eyes examining me from angles I couldn't perceive. The sensation was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, just necessary, like breathing or heartbeat. I woke to find the apartment perfectly arranged as always, every surface gleaming in anticipation of the day's invisible traffic. Somewhere in the building's structure, I could hear the soft whisper of other apartments undergoing their own nightly improvements, other tenants learning to appreciate the value of proper presentation. The jacket hangs on my shoulders now instead of in the closet, and I've realized the truth that's been staring at me from every mirror, every reflecting surface, every golden moment when the lights transform my world into something worthy of display. I never lost the jacket at all. The jacket found me. Story 11. The rubber soles always gave them away. That's what I told myself as I adjusted the focus on Theater 3. The familiar mechanical hum of the digital projector drowning out the desert wind rattling the old building's bones. 3:15 in the morning, and the Regal Palace Cinema felt like a mausoleum wrapped in red velvet and decades of accumulated dreams. The transition from 35mm had gutted most of the soul from this place, but management kept the original projection booths, probably too cheap to renovate, though they called it preserving cinema heritage in their press releases. I'd been working the overnight shift for 6 weeks now, ever since the previous projectionist quit without notice. No explanation, just cleaned out his locker and vanished. The manager, a nervous man with perpetually coffee-stained shirts, seemed relieved when I took the position. Desperate even, should have been my first warning. The focus ring responded to my touch with mechanical precision, the image on screen 3 sharpening from soft blur to crystal clarity. Tomorrow's first showing wouldn't start until 10 a.m., but the digital systems required constant babysitting. Temperature fluctuations, server hiccups, lamp degradation, a dozen variables that could transform a Tuesday matinee into a customer service nightmare. Better to catch problems at 3 in the morning than face a lobby full of angry families clutching invalidated tickets. I moved through my routine with practiced efficiency, checking each theater in numerical order. The building stretched like a concrete caterpillar, 12 screens arranged along a central spine. Theaters 1 through 6 occupied the original structure, built in 1967, while 7 through 12 comprised a later addition that never quite matched the architectural ambition of the original design. The older theaters retained character, hand-carved moldings, acoustical tiles that actually improved sound rather than simply containing it, projection booths with real windows instead of monitoring screens. Theater 4 ran its lamp test cycle without incident. Theater 5's server completed its nightly diagnostic sequence, fans whirring contentedly in the climate-controlled housing. Everything proceeded according to schedule, each system performing its programmed function with digital reliability. Then I heard them. Footsteps. Deliberate, measured. The distinctive squeak drag of rubber soles against linoleum flooring, coming from somewhere behind Projector 6. I paused, hand frozen on Theater 5's door handle, and listened. The building's ambient sound seemed to shift, the comfortable mechanical chorus of cooling fans and humming electronics, suddenly feeling inadequate to fill the space. The footsteps continued, not hurried, not secretive, but purposeful. Someone walked with familiarity through an area where no one belonged. The rational explanations assembled themselves quickly. Cleaning crew running late, security guard making rounds, maintenance worker addressing an emergency call, except I'd locked the employee entrance myself at midnight, and the alarm system showed no breached perimeters. The cleaning crew finished Mondays and Thursdays before I arrived. Security contracted to a different company, their guards responsible for external patrols only. I waited. The footsteps stopped. Moving quietly, I approached the corridor leading to Theater 6. The projection booth occupied an elevated position, accessible via a narrow staircase that doubled back on itself before terminating at a heavy steel door. From the landing, I could see the entire length of the upper hallway through safety glass windows installed during the most recent renovation. Empty. Fluorescent lights hummed in their fixtures, casting harsh shadows between banks of equipment racks and cable management systems. No movement, no signs of intrusion. But as I reached for my radio to contact building security, I caught a glimpse of motion in my peripheral vision, just the edge of a boot, worn leather, maybe brown or tan, disappearing behind the concrete pillar that housed Theater 6's main power distribution panel. I called out, voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The sound seemed to absorb into the walls rather than carry, as if the building itself swallowed my words. No response. No acknowledgement. Moving faster now, I descended to the main floor and circled around to approach the pillar from the opposite direction. The concrete cylinder stood 8 feet in diameter, housing electrical panels, network equipment, and climate control systems for the entire eastern wing. Someone could conceivably hide behind it, though they'd need to move constantly to avoid being seen from any angle. I found nothing. No footprints in the dust that accumulated despite regular cleaning. No disturbed equipment covers. No sign anyone had been there at all. But the air felt different. Warmer, as if someone had been breathing in that space moments before. Returning to my rounds, I tried to focus on the mechanical tasks at hand. Digital projection demanded attention to detail, constant monitoring of 1,000 variables that could transform entertainment into technical disaster. I checked lamp hours, verified server connections, confirmed backup systems remained online and ready. The work provided comfortable routine, predictable problems with known solutions. Theater 6 should have been routine. Same equipment as the others, same software, same maintenance schedule. I climbed to the projection booth expecting to find everything normal. Lamp warm and stable, server running the overnight diagnostic cycle, cooling systems maintaining optimal temperature. Instead, I found Theater 6 running a film, not scheduled programming. Those systems remained dormant until morning staff arrived to load the day's features. This appeared to be a test sequence, the kind technicians use to verify focus and color balance. But the content felt wrong. Instead of standard calibration patterns, the screen displayed what looked like promotional material for a film I didn't recognize. Black and white footage, grainy texture suggesting 35mm origin, showing empty corridors and stairwells that looked disturbingly similar to the Regal Palace's own architecture. I checked the server. According to the diagnostic readout, Theater 6 showed no activity. No content loaded, no playback in progress, no test sequences running. The server existed in digital slumber, waiting for tomorrow's first show, yet the screen clearly displayed moving images. I looked at the projection booth clock, an analog model installed when the building first opened. The second hand ticked steadily around the white face, 12, 1, 2, 3, then jumped backward to 12 and repeated the same 4-second cycle, over and over. The digital clock on the server showed normal time, continuing its forward progress. but the analog clock trapped itself in temporal repetition. The footage on screen shifted, camera angle changing to show what appeared to be a projection booth, very similar to the one where I stood. Similar equipment arrangement, similar window placement, similar steel door. But the image quality suggested age, not the crisp clarity of digital capture, but the organic grain structure of photochemical film stock. I watched myself watching the screen, or someone who looked exactly like me wearing identical clothing, standing in identical position. The figure on screen raised his right hand, and I realized I was also raising my right hand, matching the gesture without conscious decision. When he stepped forward, I found myself moving forward. When he turned his head toward the projection room door, I felt compelled to look in the same direction. The door was open. I hadn't left it open. Panic rising, I rushed to the main power panel and began shutting down non-essential systems. The building offered too many variables, too many automated systems that could malfunction in ways I didn't understand. Better to reduce complexity, eliminate possibilities, work with known quantities. But as I descended to the basement electrical room, I could hear the projector fan still running in Theater 6. The distinctive whir of cooling systems working to dissipate lamp heat, even though I'd cut power to the entire booth. The basement felt different than usual, warmer, like someone had been down there recently. The air tasted metallic, charged with static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. Emergency lighting cast red shadows between rows of equipment racks and cable management systems. Everything looked normal, exactly as I'd left it earlier in the week, but the space felt occupied. I found the main breaker panel and began switching off circuits one by one. Theater 6's power systems should have shut down when I opened the corresponding breaker, but as I climbed the stairs back to the main floor, I could still hear mechanical sounds from that direction. Not just the cooling fans, but something else. A rhythmic clicking, like film advancing through a mechanical gate, which was impossible. Theater 6 hadn't housed film equipment in 3 years. The main floor felt colder now, as if opening the basement had allowed some deeper chill to escape and spread through the building. My footsteps echoed differently, each sound seeming to hang in the air longer than physics should allow. I moved through the lobby, past concession stands with their chrome surfaces reflecting emergency lighting into twisted shapes, past poster displays promoting films that seemed less familiar than they should. When I reached Theater 6, the screen still showed the black and white footage, same grainy texture, same architectural spaces that mirrored the building around me. But now the camera followed someone through corridors I recognized. Past the concession stand, up the stairs to the projection level, down the hallway toward Theater 6 itself. I was watching footage of myself, recorded earlier tonight, moving through the exact sequence of actions I'd just completed. But the timestamp in the corner showed a date from 1973, 6 years after the building opened, 30 years before digital projection existed. The figure on screen, me, but not me, wearing my clothes but moving with slightly different mannerisms, approached Theater 6's door, just as I was doing, just as I had been doing, just as I would continue doing, apparently, for as long as the footage continued to play. I reached for the radio to call for help, but stopped when I realized I couldn't explain what help I needed. What would I tell them? That Theater 6 was playing a movie that didn't exist, recorded with equipment that was never installed, showing events that were happening simultaneously in the present and 3 decades in the past. Instead, I watched the screen. The figure who might be me entered the projection booth and began examining equipment that looked familiar but somehow different. Older models, different manufacturers, but arranged in essentially the same configuration. He checked the same readouts, adjusted the same controls, followed the same routine I'd been following since I started this job. But when he looked at the screen to verify image quality, he saw exactly what I was seeing. Himself, looking at a screen that showed himself looking at a screen that showed. The recursion felt infinite, each reflection slightly degraded from the previous iteration, like standing between parallel mirrors and watching yourself disappear into mathematical distance. How many levels deep did it go? How many versions of this moment existed in the film, each one containing all the others? I checked my watch. 4:19 in the morning, but the analog clock in the booth still ticked through the same 4-second cycle, trapped in temporal repetition while linear time continued around it. How long had I been watching? How long had Theater 6 been playing this impossible film? The footage shifted perspective again, showing the basement electrical room where I'd been standing minutes or hours ago. Same red emergency lighting, same equipment placement. But now I could see what I'd missed during my actual visit. Footprints in the dust around the main power panel. Recent footprints, made by someone wearing boots with distinctive rubber soles. My boots. But I'd been wearing sneakers tonight. I looked down at my feet and saw the worn leather boots I'd glimpsed behind the pillar earlier. Brown leather, scuffed from years of use, with thick rubber soles that would produce exactly the squeaking, dragging sound I'd heard. I had no memory of changing footwear, no memory of owning these boots. But they felt familiar, as if I'd worn them every night for years. The screen showed me climbing the stairs from the basement, moving through the lobby, approaching Theater 6. But this version of me moved with confidence, knowing exactly what he'd find, unsurprised by the impossible film playing on the screen. He entered the projection booth and began adjusting controls I didn't recognize, working with equipment that shouldn't exist. I reached for the same controls and found them exactly where the screen indicated they would be. My hands moved automatically, muscle memory guiding actions I'd never learned, adjusting settings for systems I'd never trained on. The image quality improved, focus sharpening, contrast deepening. As if I'd been fine-tuning this particular setup for decades, the timestamp advanced to 1974, then 1975, then jumped forward to 1982. Different footage, but the same impossible documentation of events that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar. Different versions of me, or someone who looked exactly like me, performing the same routine in different eras. Same building, same job, same late-night discoveries that something was fundamentally wrong with Theater 6. But in each era, the person on screen seemed more comfortable with the impossibility, less surprised, more accepting. As if this job requirement, maintaining a theater that projected films of its own operation across multiple decades, was simply part of the work. I understood then why the previous projectionist had left without explanation, not because he'd discovered something terrible, but because he'd discovered the alternative was worse. The job continued whether you accepted it or not. The work demanded completion regardless of the worker's comprehension or consent. The footage reached 1989, then 1995, then 2003, the year digital projection replaced film throughout the complex. But Theater 6 continued playing its impossible movie, documenting the work of projectionists who looked exactly like me, performing identical routines across 46 years of continuous operation. And now I knew what I had to do. What I'd always known I had to do, though the knowledge felt simultaneously alien and inevitable. I had to maintain the equipment, verify the image quality, and ensure the film continued playing. Because that was the job. That was what the position required. The work was more complex than I'd understood when I accepted the position 6 weeks ago, or 6 years ago, or 16 years ago. The timeline felt fluid now, memories rearranging themselves to accommodate expanded responsibilities. I'd been the projectionist here for decades, maintaining systems that bridged analog and digital, film and reality, past and present. The rubber soles were standard equipment, provided by management, better for grip on metal floors. The boots felt comfortable now, broken in from years of use. Theater 6 required special attention, but that was noted in the employee manual I'd somehow never fully read. Page 47, Section 12. 3. Temporal projection systems require continuous monitoring. Staff assigned to Theater 6 overnight maintenance must ensure operational continuity across all chronological parameters. Simple enough. I'd been overthinking the situation. I settled into the routine, checking systems, adjusting parameters, ensuring the film continued playing without interruption. Outside, the desert dawn crept across Tucson's horizon. But inside Theater 6, time moved differently, more flexibly, more accommodating to the requirements of the work. The day shift would arrive in a few hours. They'd find me exactly where I belonged, maintaining the equipment, ensuring operational continuity. They wouldn't ask questions about the special requirements of Theater 6. just as I hadn't asked questions when I inherited the position from my predecessor. Who had looked exactly like me, I realized. Who had worn the same boots, followed the same routine, maintained the same impossible systems that kept the theater operating across decades of continuous service. The work was important, more important than I'd initially understood. I adjusted the focus one final time and settled in to watch the film. There was so much more to learn, so many years of documentation to review, so many versions of this moment to catalog and maintain. The rubber soles squeaked softly against the metal floor as I walked, just as they always had, just as they always would. Story 12. The desert breathes differently at 3 in the morning. Phoenix sprawls beneath a canopy of static stars, its arteries of asphalt still radiating heat from the day's furnace. I've been driving these streets for 2 years now, picking up the city's insomniacs, shift workers, and the occasional drunk stumbling home from Mill Avenue. You learn to read the darkness when it's your office. Every shadow tells a story. Every passenger carries secrets. That Tuesday started like any other. My phone buzzed with a pickup request from Desert Palms Condominiums, one of those upscale complexes that sprouted in the Ahwatukee foothills during the housing boom. The kind of place where retirees migrate to die under perpetual sunshine, trading snow shovels for golf clubs and complaining about the heat they moved here to embrace. The guard at the gate waved me through without looking up from his magazine. Security lights cast long shadows between the buildings, and my headlights swept across rows of identical balconies, each one a small rectangular promise of comfort and isolation. Building C sat at the far end of the complex, tucked against a wash that carried flash floods during monsoon season, but now lay bone dry, filled only with tumbleweeds and the occasional coyote. I parked beneath a flickering streetlight and checked my phone. The passenger hadn't provided a name, just showed up as passenger in the app. Sometimes people do that for privacy, though it always made me slightly uneasy. I rolled down the windows and waited, the engine idling with that familiar diesel rumble that had become the soundtrack to my nights. She emerged from the shadows between buildings like she'd been standing there all along, waiting. The first thing I noticed was how silently she moved, her steps making no sound on the concrete pathway. A light-colored scarf covered her hair, tied beneath her chin in a way that reminded me of old photographs from my grandmother's era. Her clothing was nondescript, a dark coat that seemed to absorb the ambient light rather than reflect it. The rear door opened with a soft click, and she slid into the back seat without a word. Through the rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of her profile. Deeply lined skin, eyes that seemed focused on something beyond the physical world, hands folded in her lap with the careful precision of someone accustomed to waiting. "Good evening," I said, adjusting the mirror to get a better look. "Where are we headed tonight?" She didn't respond immediately. Her lips moved slightly, as if she were having a conversation with someone I couldn't see. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of decades and an accent I couldn't quite place. "The hospital. Emergency entrance. I programmed the destination into my GPS. Chandler Regional Medical Center, about 15 minutes away through surface streets. The app estimated 12 minutes, but I'd learned to add time for Phoenix traffic, even at this ungodly hour." As we pulled out of the complex, I tried making conversation. Most passengers at this time of night were either chatty drunks or exhausted workers, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on her hands. The scarf framed her face in a way that made her features indistinct, like looking at someone through frosted glass. The radio played softly, a late-night talk show discussing conspiracy theories about government surveillance. I reached over to change the station, but she spoke again, startling me. "Leave it." Her tone brooked no argument, so I left my hand on the wheel and focused on driving. The host's voice droned about hidden cameras and secret watchers, his words punctuated by the occasional caller describing paranoid delusions that sounded increasingly plausible in the pre-dawn darkness. We drove through neighborhoods where porch lights created islands of safety in an ocean of shadows. Occasionally, I'd catch her reflection in the side mirrors, but she seemed to shift position whenever I tried to focus on her image. always remaining slightly out of clear view. The seatbelt on her side was pulled taut, the mechanism locked in place despite the fact that I hadn't heard the familiar click of engagement when she entered the car. Halfway to the hospital, she began speaking again, but not to me. Her voice was so low it barely registered above the engine noise, a stream of words in what sounded like Spanish, though some syllables carried inflections I didn't recognize. It sounded like a prayer, or perhaps a confession, the kind of desperate whispers people make when they think no one is listening. The hospital appeared ahead, its emergency room blazing with fluorescent urgency against the desert night. I pulled into the drop-off area, the car's headlights illuminating the automatic doors and the lone security guard visible through the glass entrance. "Here we are," I announced, putting the car in park and turning to inform her about the pickup location if she needed a return ride. The back seat was empty. I blinked hard, certain my exhaustion was playing tricks on my vision, but the seat remained vacant, the upholstery still bearing the slight indentation where someone had been sitting moments before. The seatbelt hung loose now, no longer stretched across the space where a passenger should have been. My hands trembled as I reached back to touch the seat. The fabric was cold, but not unusually so. Everything in Phoenix feels cold compared to the day's residual heat. I checked the door handles, thinking she might have slipped out while I was watching the road, but I would have felt the change in air pressure, heard the sound of a door opening and closing. That's when I noticed the fog on the window. A small oval patch of condensation clung to the glass directly behind where she had been sitting, roughly at face level. It was the kind of mark left by warm breath against a cold surface, though the night air was still warm enough to keep the windows clear. As I watched, the fog began to dissipate, leaving behind a streak that looked almost like a handprint, or perhaps the impression of someone's final exhalation. I sat there for several minutes, engine running, trying to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps she'd gotten out while I was distracted by the radio, moved so quietly that I hadn't noticed. People do strange things when they're ill or in distress. Maybe she was experiencing some kind of medical emergency that affected her behavior, her ability to communicate normally. The app showed the trip as completed, automatically charging her credit card, the standard fare, plus a small tip. The transaction went through without issue, which meant her account was real, her information legitimate. But passengers don't just vanish from locked vehicles. I drove home through the empty streets, replaying every moment of the ride in my head. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd almost convinced myself that exhaustion and too many consecutive nights of driving had created a perfectly reasonable explanation for what felt like an impossible experience. Sleep came fitfully that morning, filled with dreams of empty back seats and whispered prayers in languages that shifted and changed before I could understand them. The next night, I received another pickup request from Desert Palms condominiums. This time, I almost declined. The rational part of my mind insisted that coincidences happen, that someone else in that sprawling complex might need a ride to the hospital. But something deeper, some primitive instinct that evolution had embedded in my nervous system, screamed warnings I couldn't ignore. Curiosity won out over caution. I drove to the same building, parked under the same flickering streetlight, and waited. The silence felt heavier than the night before, pregnant with anticipation that made my skin crawl. Every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it, and the air carried a scent I couldn't identify, something medicinal mixed with desert sage and the faint sweetness of decay. She appeared at exactly the same time, emerging from the same cluster of shadows with that same soundless walk. The scarf, the coat, the careful posture, everything identical to the previous night, down to the way she folded her hands in her lap after sliding into the back seat. "The hospital," she said before I could ask. "Emergency entrance." This time, I was ready. I watched her continuously through the rearview mirror, determined to catch whatever sleight of hand or optical illusion had fooled me before. Her reflection remained frustratingly unclear, always slightly out of focus no matter how I adjusted the mirror's angle. The radio was already tuned to the conspiracy theory show, and she again requested that I leave it on. The host was discussing disappearances, people who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and the lingering sense that reality contained gaps no one wanted to acknowledge. Her whispered prayers began earlier this time, as soon as we left the complex. The words seemed more urgent, more desperate, like someone bargaining with forces beyond human comprehension. I strained to make out individual phrases, but the language remained elusive, familiar enough to seem almost recognizable, but strange enough to slip away from understanding. Halfway to the hospital, I tried an experiment. I adjusted the temperature controls, cranking the air conditioning to its coldest setting. If she was real, if she was breathing, the sudden temperature change should create visible exhalation, prove her physical presence in ways that couldn't be explained away. Nothing happened. The air grew cold, but no breath became visible. The fog that had appeared on the window the night before was absent, though I could swear I felt warmth radiating from the back seat. Not the oppressive heat of the desert, but something more personal, more immediate. At the hospital, the same thing happened. I turned to address her, and the seat was empty. The seatbelt hung loose, though I'd watched it remain taut throughout the entire journey. No fog appeared on the window this time, but the air in the car felt different, thinner somehow, as if something essential had been extracted from it. The transaction processed normally. My bank account showed 2 identical fares from Desert Palms to Chandler Regional, both paid by the same phantom credit card. I started asking questions. The night guard at the complex turned out to be more observant than his casual demeanor suggested. When I described my passenger, his expression shifted from bored professionalism to something approaching unease. "You're not the first driver to mention her," he said, glancing toward Building C with obvious reluctance. "Been going on for months now, always the same description, always the same destination." He explained that other rideshare drivers had reported similar experiences, passengers who disappeared before reaching the hospital, trips that registered as completed despite the impossible circumstances. Most drivers assumed they'd been pranked or had fallen asleep at the wheel, creating false memories to fill gaps in their consciousness. "But here's the thing," the guard continued, lowering his voice as if afraid of being overheard. "Nobody matching that description lives in Building C. Hell, nobody lives in half those units. They've been empty since the original owners died or moved to assisted living facilities." The revelation should have provided comfort, a rational explanation for the impossible. Instead, it made everything worse. If no one lived in those units, where was she coming from? And why did my GPS consistently register pickups from a specific apartment number in a supposedly vacant building? That night, I received a third request from Desert Palms. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to ignore it, to turn off the app and drive in the opposite direction until the desert swallowed Phoenix behind me. But something stronger than fear compelled me forward, a need to understand, to find answers that made sense in a world that seemed increasingly determined to deny logic. I arrived earlier this time, parking in a different spot with a better view of Building C's entrance. The structure looked like all the others, stucco and tile construction designed to blend with the desert landscape, complete with xeriscaped courtyards and strategically placed palm trees. But something about it felt wrong, like a movie set designed to look real from a distance but revealing its artificial nature under close examination. The apartment number in my app corresponded to a unit on the second floor. Through the wraparound balcony, I could see sliding glass doors that reflected nothing but darkness. No lights, no furniture, no signs of habitation. Yet the app insisted someone was waiting there. Someone who needed transportation to a hospital emergency room. She appeared right on schedule, but this time, I was watching carefully enough to see something that made my blood freeze. She didn't walk out of the building's entrance or descend the external staircase. Instead, she seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves, coalescing from darkness into a form that suggested rather than defined the boundaries of a human figure. The car door opened and she slid into the back seat with that same careful precision. But this time, as I watched through the rearview mirror, I noticed something that had escaped my attention during the previous rides. She cast no reflection in the passenger side windows. The mirror showed her form clearly enough, though always slightly out of focus, but the side windows that should have displayed her profile remained empty. It was as if she existed only in the space directly behind me, visible only when viewed through the specific angle of the rearview mirror. "The hospital," she said, her voice carrying a note of urgency that hadn't been present before. "Emergency entrance. Please hurry." This time, I complied. Something in her tone suggested that time was running out, though for what, I couldn't say. I drove faster than usual, taking turns with more aggression than passenger comfort typically warranted. The radio played its familiar soundtrack of paranoid theories and midnight confessions, but her prayers had become more frantic, more desperate. As we neared the hospital, she leaned forward slightly, and I caught a clearer glimpse of her face in the mirror. What I saw made me understand why her reflection had always seemed frustratingly unclear. Her features were wrong, not dramatically, not in ways that would immediately register as inhuman, but subtly off in proportions that suggested someone's imperfect memory of what a person should look like. Her eyes were slightly too large, her mouth positioned a fraction of an inch too high, her nose angled in a way that defied the normal architecture of human faces. It was like looking at a photograph that had been subtly manipulated, changed just enough to create an uncanny valley effect that made extended observation physically uncomfortable. At the hospital, I didn't turn around immediately. Instead, I watched through the mirror as she reached for the door handle. Her hand passed through it twice before making contact, as if she had to concentrate to maintain sufficient solidity to interact with physical objects. "Thank you," she said, her voice already fading as she spoke. When I finally turned around, the seat was empty again. But this time something was different. A folded piece of paper sat where she had been, old and yellowed around the edges, covered with handwriting in an ink that seemed to shift between brown and red, depending on the angle of light. I picked up the paper with hands that shook, despite my efforts to remain calm. The writing was in Spanish, but my high school classes were sufficient to translate the basic meaning. It was a letter, written in the careful script of someone unaccustomed to writing, addressed to someone named Esperanza. The content was heartbreaking in its simplicity, a mother apologizing to her daughter for not being present during her final moments, for being unable to provide comfort during a difficult passing. The letter spoke of guilt that transcended death, of love that bound souls to unfinished business, of desperate attempts to bridge the gap between the living and the departed. But it was the date at the top of the letter that made everything click into place with horrible clarity. The letter was dated 3 months ago, exactly when the guard had said the strange passenger requests began appearing in drivers' apps. I looked up to see the hospital's emergency room entrance, its automatic doors sliding open and closed in an endless cycle of arrivals and departures. And standing just inside the glass, barely visible in the fluorescent lighting, was a woman in scrubs who bore an unmistakable resemblance to my vanished passenger. The younger woman, Esperanza presumably, moved through the hospital's interior with the efficient purpose of someone accustomed to late-night emergencies. She paused near the information desk, speaking with a colleague, her gestures animated by the particular energy that comes with saving lives and preventing deaths. I sat in my car, letter in hand, watching this woman who had no idea her mother's spirit was desperately attempting to reach her, to deliver a message of love and regret across an impossible divide. The hospital's routine continued around her, unaware that somewhere in the space between dimensions, a worried mother was paying phantom credit cards to hire drivers who could ferry her between the world of the living and the realm of unfinished business. The app on my phone buzzed with a new notification. Another request from Desert Palms condominiums, scheduled for the same time tomorrow night. I closed the app and drove home through streets that seemed different now, populated by shadows that might contain more than mere absence of light. The letter remained on my passenger seat, a tangible link between worlds that apparently existed closer together than anyone wanted to admit. The next night, I took a different route home from work. But 3 days later, my curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself parked outside Desert Palms again, waiting beneath the same flickering streetlight. She appeared as always, materializing from shadows with that same purposeful silence. This time, instead of driving directly to the hospital, I made a detour through the parking lot, circling slowly until we passed beneath a well-lit area near the complex's community center. In the bright illumination, I turned to look directly at her instead of relying on the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty, though I could hear her voice clearly, giving directions in that same urgent tone. The seatbelt remained taut, stretched across what should have been her torso, and the letter, which I'd left on the seat as an experiment, was now folded differently, creased by invisible hands. "The hospital," she repeated, her voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Please, she works tonight." I drove to Chandler Regional and parked in the visitor area instead of the emergency entrance. Through the hospital's windows, I could see Esperanza moving through her rounds, checking on patients with the same careful attention her mother had shown when folding her hands in my back seat. The family resemblance was unmistakable now that I knew what to look for. The same bone structure, the same careful posture, the same suggestion of strength tempered by compassion. "She can't see you," I said to the empty back seat. "You know that, right?" The response came as a whisper that seemed to emanate from the car's upholstery itself. "I know, but I can see her. I can know she's safe, that she's helping people, that she became everything I hoped she would become. Sometimes, that's enough." The seatbelt relaxed, and the presence in my car faded like smoke dissipating in still air. But before she vanished completely, I felt something brush against my shoulder. Gentle, grateful, carrying the warmth of a mother's love that death couldn't diminish. The app processed another payment, and I drove home through the pre-dawn darkness, carrying questions that would never find complete answers. I still drive for the rideshare apps, still work the night shift through Phoenix's empty streets. The requests from Desert Palm stopped coming after that night, though sometimes I detour through the complex anyway, drawn by a compulsion I can't explain. The guard tells me other drivers report similar experiences, passengers who vanish before reaching their destinations, trips that register as completed despite impossible circumstances. We compare notes sometimes, trading stories of the city's nocturnal mysteries, creating an informal catalog of encounters that exist in the spaces between rational explanation and accepted reality. Last week, I received a request from a different complex across town. The passenger wanted to go to Phoenix Children's Hospital, and something in the way the pickup location appeared on my map made my hands shake as I accepted the ride. But that's a different story, for a different night. Phoenix breathes differently at 3 in the morning, and sometimes, if you listen carefully enough, you can hear the whispered prayers of those who love too deeply to let death create permanent separation. The desert keeps its secrets, but occasionally, it allows living drivers to serve as bridges between worlds that exist closer together than anyone wants to admit. I keep the letter in my glove compartment now, a reminder that some passengers pay their fares in more than money, and some destinations can't be reached by following GPS directions. The city's arterial roads carry more than traffic. They transport the hopes and regrets of souls who refuse to accept that love has expiration dates. And sometimes, in the early morning hours when reality grows thin and possibilities multiply in the shadows, I catch glimpses of other passengers in my rearview mirror. People who shouldn't be there, riding to places that exist only in the space between heartbeats and the whispered promises we make to those we've lost. Story 13. The static crackles like dying embers in the pre-dawn darkness of my Radio Shack, and I know it's almost time. My fingers drum against the wooden desk as the digital clock shifts from 2:10 to 2:11 a.m., casting its pale green glow across the cluttered room. Outside, the Maine coast breathes its ancient rhythm against the rocks below, but inside this converted attic space, something else keeps time entirely. 3 weeks have passed since Uncle Ezra disappeared from the shipyard. Disappeared. That's the word everyone uses, though we all know what it means when a 73-year-old man with a weak heart doesn't come home from his night security rounds. The Coast Guard called off their search after 5 days, and the company held a small memorial service that felt as hollow as the winter wind howling through the crane scaffolding where he'd spent his final hours. But Ezra didn't disappear, not entirely. He found a new way to communicate. The receiver hisses with electromagnetic interference, and then click, 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 click. The pattern emerges from the white noise like a message in a bottle washing ashore after decades at sea. 3 short, 1 long, 3 short, SOS in Morse code, But that's not what makes my skin crawl. It's what follows. Click, 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 click. E-Z-E. Ezra's old pager code from the 80s, back when the shipyard workers used those bulky black devices to coordinate shifts and overtime schedules. He'd drummed that pattern on every surface when he was thinking. The kitchen table during Sunday dinners, the steering wheel of his rusted Chevy, the workbench in his basement workshop. 3 letters that somehow managed to follow him into whatever comes after. I lean forward, adjusting the frequency dial with trembling fingers. The signal strengthens, becoming more distinct, more deliberate. Each click seems to resonate not just through the radio speakers, but through the house itself, as if the old Victorians' wooden bones are conducting the message through their grain. The rhythm is hypnotic, insistent, a digital heartbeat that shouldn't exist. My hand moves to the Morse key beside the receiver. I tap out a response, spelling my own call sign into the ether. The metal paddle feels cold under my fingertips, colder than the November night seeping through the loose window frames. The house answers. A sharp crack echoes from downstairs, the sound of the old pendant light in the basement swaying on its chain. I've heard it before, always at this moment, always in response to my transmitted signal. The bulb casts shifting shadows through the floor register above the cellar stairs, shadows that dance with no apparent source. I push back from the desk, chair legs scraping against the hardwood floor. The signal continues its patient broadcast, neither growing stronger nor fading, just maintaining its steady presence like a beacon calling ships to harbor. But this harbor feels anything but safe. The basement stairs creak under my weight, protesting my descent into the musty air below. The pendant light still sways gently, its bare bulb creating an erratic strobe effect across the stone foundation walls. I installed LED fixtures throughout the house 2 years ago, but this old incandescent bulb refuses to burn out, refuses to be replaced, refuses to stay still. My flashlight beam sweeps across the basement's familiar contents, cardboard boxes of holiday decorations, my father's woodworking tools gathering dust, the oil furnace humming contentedly in the corner. But it's the far wall that draws my attention, the same wall I've been drawn to every night since the signals began. The stones are older than the house, part of the original foundation laid in 1887. Sometime in the 60s, someone, probably my grandfather, mortared over a section near the northeast corner, creating a smooth patch about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. The newer mortar is lighter than the surrounding stone, creating what looks like a doorway that was never meant to be opened, or a doorway that was deliberately sealed. I approach the wall, my footsteps echoing hollow in the confined space. The temperature drops noticeably as I near the mortared section, my breath beginning to mist despite the furnace's warmth. My palm presses against the cold stone, and for a moment, just a moment, I swear I feel something pressing back from the other side. The radio upstairs continues its broadcast, the signal now seeming to emanate from the wall itself rather than the receiver in my shack. The Morse code pattern has evolved, become more complex. No longer just EZE, but longer sequences that I can barely follow. Messages within messages, layered communications that speak of urgency and impatience. I pull out my phone, activate the voice recorder, and hold it against the wall. The stone conducts sound differently here, amplifying low-frequency vibrations that my ears can barely detect. Played back at increased speed, the recordings reveal patterns within patterns. Not just Morse code, but something resembling the old pneumatic tube systems the shipyard used for sending blueprints between buildings. A whooshing, pressurized rhythm that suggests movement through confined spaces, underground spaces. My fingers trace the mortar seams, searching for irregularities, weak points, anything that might explain the sensations I'm experiencing. The pointing compound crumbles slightly under pressure, revealing cavities behind the stone face. Not empty space exactly, but something less solid than earth, less permanent than bedrock. The pendant light above me stops swaying. In the sudden stillness, I become aware of other sounds. The house settling, the furnace cycling, the distant crash of waves against the cliff face. But underneath these familiar noises runs something else, something that resembles breathing, but lacks the organic rhythm of living lungs. It's mechanical, regulated, like the sound a diving helmet makes when air is pumped through its copper valves. Ezra wore equipment like that during his Navy years, back when underwater welding meant bulky brass helmets and manual air pumps operated by topside crews. He'd described the sensation to me once: the claustrophobia, the constant awareness of your life depending on a thin tube connecting you to the surface world, the way sound traveled differently through water and metal, the way sound travels differently through stone and earth. I press my ear against the wall, listening past the house's ambient noise, past the ocean's rhythm, past my own elevated heartbeat. There, faint but unmistakable, the sound of metal tapping against stone, not the random percussion of old pipes expanding and contracting, but deliberate, measured strikes. Morse code, transmitted through solid matter instead of electromagnetic waves. EZE. But this time, the pattern doesn't stop. It continues, spelling out longer sequences that I recognize as coordinates, latitude and longitude measurements precise to the second, numbers that place me exactly here, in this basement, against this wall, at this moment. My phone buzzes with an incoming text message. The number is blocked, but the content is clear. Open. I stare at the screen, watching the message timestamp. 2:47 a.m. I've been in the basement for over 30 minutes, though it feels like seconds. Time moves differently down here, flowing around me like water around a stone. The temperature continues dropping, my breath now clearly visible in the basement's stagnant air. Another text arrives. Behind. Then another. Wall. The messages come faster now. Single words that combine into phrases. Phrases that become urgently coherent. Been waiting. So long. Promised. Come home. My hands shake as I scroll through the accumulating texts. Each message carries the same blocked number, the same impossible timestamp variants. Some arrive before I finish reading their predecessors, creating a cascading conversation with someone or something that exists outside normal temporal boundaries. The final message contains only coordinates, but not the ones I expected. These numbers place me 30 feet below ground level, in a space that shouldn't exist beneath the house foundation, a space that corresponds exactly with the sealed section of wall. I retrieve a hammer from my father's workbench, its weight familiar and reassuring in my trembling hands. The first blow against the mortar sends vibrations through the entire foundation, a percussion that the house's wooden frame amplifies and carries upward through every floor and rafter. Dust rains from the basement ceiling as the structure responds to this violation of its sealed integrity. The second blow cracks the mortar significantly, revealing the dark cavity behind. Air moves through the gap. Not the stale atmosphere I expected, but something fresher, carrying scents of ocean spray and machine oil. The smell of the shipyard on a foggy morning, when the harbor fog mingles with the industrial odors of welding torches and diesel engines. My flashlight beam penetrates the opening, illuminating a space that defies the house's architectural logic. Instead of earth or bedrock, the cavity extends backward into worked stone, forming what appears to be a tunnel system carved from the living rock beneath the foundation. The walls show tool marks, not the random scratches of natural erosion, but the deliberate patterns left by human implements. Chisels, perhaps, or the pneumatic tools used in quarry operations. The radio upstairs falls silent. In that sudden absence of signal, I become aware of how much the constant Morse code transmission had become part of the house's ambient sound profile. Without it, the basement feels hollow, expectant, like a theater moments before the curtain rises. The pendant light remains motionless, its bulb casting steady illumination that somehow seems brighter than before. I widen the opening, removing chunks of mortar and loose stone until the gap becomes large enough to crawl through. The tunnel beyond slopes downward at a gentle angle, following what must be a natural fissure in the coastal bedrock. My flashlight reveals support timbers, old-growth pine planks that show the marks of hand tools rather than modern sawmill blades. These supports are older than the house, possibly older than any recorded construction in the area. The tunnel floor is covered with a thin layer of sand and crushed shell, the kind of material that accumulates in tidal caves. But we're too far from the ocean for direct tidal influence, too high above sea level for normal wave action. This sand has been carried here deliberately, spread as a walking surface by someone who used this passage regularly, someone who needed to move between locations without being observed. My phone vibrates with another message. Follow. The text includes an attachment, an old photograph that takes several seconds to download over the weak cellular signal. When it finally appears, I recognize Ezra's face immediately, but he looks decades younger. He's wearing a Navy diving helmet, standing beside what appears to be construction equipment on a rocky shoreline. Behind him, I can make out the early framework of what would eventually become the modern shipyard. But it's the background details that make my chest tighten. The photograph shows tunnel openings carved into the coastal cliff face, multiple entrances that connect the waterfront to inland locations, a network of passages that would allow workers to move between sites without exposure to Maine's harsh weather, without being visible to anyone monitoring the harbor approaches. A network that includes this tunnel. I download the photo to my phone's gallery and examine it more closely. The timestamp shows 1962, 15 years before the shipyard's official opening. Whatever was being constructed here began much earlier than the public records indicate, and involved infrastructure that doesn't appear on any municipal planning documents. Infrastructure that extends beneath my house. The tunnel continues deeper than my flashlight beam can penetrate, curving gradually to the left in what feels like a wide arc. I follow it for perhaps 50 yards before encountering the first branch, a narrower passage that angles upward, toward what must be the surface. Another branch appears 20 feet further, this one descending more steeply into the bedrock below. Each junction is marked with carved symbols, weathered but still legible. Not letters or numbers, but geometric patterns that resemble maritime navigation marks. The kind of symbols used to mark safe passages and hidden hazards, to guide experienced travelers through complex routes, to warn newcomers of dangers ahead. My phone shows no signal in the tunnel depths, but somehow continues receiving text messages. The block number sends coordinates for each junction, guiding me through the branching system with the precision of someone who knows every turn, every obstacle, every safe route through the underground network. Someone who has traveled these passages many times before. The main tunnel eventually opens into a larger chamber, a natural cave that has been expanded and reinforced with the same old-growth timber supports. The space is perhaps 30 feet across, with a ceiling high enough to stand upright. Most remarkably, it shows signs of recent use. Battery-powered lanterns hanging from iron hooks, folding chairs arranged around what might have been a meeting area, a chemical toilet discreetly placed behind a privacy screen. This isn't an abandoned historical site. People have been using this space regularly, possibly for decades. A wooden table occupies the chamber's center, its surface covered with maritime charts and construction blueprints. The documents are secured under glass weights, protected from the humid cave environment, but accessible for consultation. Many show the shipyard's layout from various time periods, revealing expansions and modifications that span 60 years of continuous development. But it's the newest charts that capture my attention. These show proposed changes to the facility, massive excavations that would extend the dry dock system deep into the coastal bedrock, creating submarine maintenance facilities that could service nuclear vessels in complete secrecy. The scale of construction would require moving thousands of tons of stone, creating waste materials that would need to be disposed of without attracting attention. Waste materials that could be used to seal tunnel entrances, to hide evidence of the underground network's existence. My flashlight beam sweeps across the chamber walls, revealing more carved symbols in what appears to be a communication system. Pneumatic tubes that disappear into the rock face, connecting this central hub to other locations throughout the network. One tube is larger than the others, wide enough to accommodate small packages or written messages, wide enough for a thin man to crawl through, if circumstances required desperate measures. I approach the tube system, noting fresh scratches around the main opening. Someone has used this recently, probably within the last few weeks. The interior shows signs of passage, fabric fibers caught on rough edges, scuff marks that suggest urgent movement. My phone vibrates with a final message. Almost home. The timestamp shows 2:11 a.m., though my watch reads 4:33. Time has become negotiable in this underground space, subject to rules that don't apply in the surface world. The blocked number sends one last coordinate set, placing me exactly at the chamber's center, placing me at the destination Ezra has been guiding me toward. The radio signal resumes, transmitted through the cave's stone walls with perfect clarity, but now it carries more than Morse code. It includes voice transmission, words spoken through what sounds like an old Navy diving helmet communication system. The voice is familiar, aged but unmistakable. "You found it," Ezra says through the static. "Knew you would. Smart boy. Always listened when the old man talked about frequencies and signals." I key the portable radio clipped to my belt, transmitting back into the underground network. "Where are you, Uncle? Everyone thinks you're gone?" His laughter echoes through multiple speakers, suggesting the communication system extends throughout the tunnel network. Gone where exactly? I'm closer than I've been in years, closer than they wanted me to be. The chamber's battery-powered lanterns flicker on automatically, revealing details my flashlight had missed. Photographs mounted on the walls show the underground construction project from its beginning. Teams of workers expanding natural caves, installing support systems, creating a hidden infrastructure beneath the shipyard and surrounding coastal properties. Workers who included a much younger Ezra. 40 years I kept their secret. His voice continues. Helped build what they said was a government project, national security, all that patriotic nonsense. Didn't ask questions when men disappeared after the work was finished. Didn't wonder where they went when they knew too much. The photographs show workers who look familiar, faces I recognize from old family gatherings, men who supposedly moved away or died in accidents or simply vanished from the community records. Men who shared Ezra's knowledge of the underground network. But I was smarter than they thought. Kept copies of everything, hid evidence in places they couldn't reach, places they didn't know existed. The static clears, bringing his voice into sharp focus. Places like this chamber, where the truth waits for someone brave enough to find it. A section of the chamber wall slides aside, revealing a hidden archive. Filing cabinets filled with blueprints, contracts, photographs, and correspondence dating back to the facility's true beginning. Evidence of agreements between government agencies and private contractors, of funding streams that don't appear in public records, of decisions made in rooms that officially don't exist. Evidence that certain people would kill to keep hidden. They tried to make me disappear like the others. Ezra's voice carries a note of satisfaction. But disappearing was my idea, not theirs. Let them think I'm gone while I collect what they left behind, while I prepare to share what they hoped would die with me. My hands shake as I examine the archive contents. Names I recognize from local politics and business. Signatures on documents that authorize activities far beyond the shipyard's official purpose. Photographs of equipment that shouldn't exist in civilian facilities. The scope of the deception extends throughout the coastal community, involving people I've known my entire life. People who believe Ezra took these secrets with him when he vanished. But you're not gone, I transmit back. You're here in this network. You've been here all along. The silence stretches long enough that I begin to worry the communication system has failed. Then his voice returns, carrying an undertone I don't recognize, something between sadness and relief. "Am I here?" he asks. "Or are you somewhere else entirely?" Hard to tell, isn't it, when you're this deep underground, when you've been alone with secrets for so long that reality becomes negotiable. The chamber's temperature drops suddenly, my breath misting in air that had been warm moments before. The battery-powered lanterns dim, their illumination taking on an unusual quality that makes the carved symbols appear to move, to shift position when viewed peripherally. The tunnel network is real, I say, more to convince myself than to communicate with Ezra. The evidence is real. The photos, the documents, they're physical proof of what happened here. Real, he agrees. But whose reality? The one where I disappeared from the shipyard 3 weeks ago? The one where you're standing in a basement talking to a radio? Or the one where a man can exist in spaces between spaces, where messages travel through stone and time runs backward? I look around the chamber, noting details that seem different from when I first arrived. The folding chairs are arranged differently. The maritime charts show locations that weren't marked before. The photographs on the walls include images of me standing in locations I haven't visited, taken from angles that suggest the photographer was positioned in impossible places. Every night at 2:11, Ezra's voice continues, you receive my signal. Every night you follow it to the basement wall. Every night you break through the mortar and find this chamber. Every night you discover the same evidence, learn the same truth, make the same choice. My phone shows the time as 2:11 a.m. Though I've been underground for hours, the timestamp on every received message shows 2:11 a.m., as if time stops at that moment and refuses to advance until some condition is satisfied. What choice? I ask, though part of me already knows the answer. Whether to surface with what you've learned, or remain here where the truth is safe. Whether to risk becoming another disappeared person, or accept that some realities are more real than others. The archive files blur when I try to focus on their contents, words reshuffling themselves into new configurations that change meaning with each reading. The photographs show different faces depending on viewing angle, familiar people transforming into strangers and back again. The evidence I thought I'd discovered becomes suspect, possibly imagined, possibly planted by a mind that has spent too many nights alone with radio static and unfulfilled grief. The signal led me here for a reason, I insist. There's something you need me to do, something you need me to understand. The signal, Ezra repeats thoughtfully. Yes, that's where it starts, isn't it? Where it always starts. You hear my call sign in the static, follow it to the basement, break through the wall. But consider this possibility. What if the signal isn't coming from the underground network? The chamber's walls seem to shift, perspectives altering in ways that suggest the space is larger than I initially perceived, or smaller, or configured entirely differently than my eyes report. The tunnel entrances multiply, then decrease, then disappear entirely before reappearing in new locations. What if the signal is coming from inside your own head? From the part of your mind that can't accept that some people simply vanish without explanation? From the nephew who needs to believe his uncle left messages rather than just leaving? I examine my radio equipment, searching for signs of malfunction or external interference. The portable unit shows strong signal strength, but the frequency it's receiving doesn't match any of the channels I remember tuning. The display shows numbers that change when I'm not looking directly at them, readings that suggest I'm monitoring stations that don't exist on the electromagnetic spectrum. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, Ezra observes. 3 weeks of grief and guilt, and the kind of isolation that makes a man's mind create what it needs to survive. 3 weeks of believing you're receiving signals from beyond, instead of acknowledging the signals your own brain generates when reality becomes too difficult to accept. The chamber temperature continues dropping, but now I recognize the sensation as shock rather than supernatural influence. My body's response to the possibility that everything I've experienced, the underground network, the hidden archive, the mysterious communication system, exists only in the space between sleep and waking, in the liminal hours when grief reshapes perception into something bearable. But this is real, I say, holding up handfuls of documents from the archive. I can touch it, photograph it, take it back to the surface as proof. Real, Ezra agrees. Real as anything else in your current state of mind. Real as the radio signals that may or may not exist. Real as the uncle who may or may not be trying to communicate from wherever people go when they disappear. I look at the documents in my hands, watching the words swim across pages that feel substantial but somehow insubstantial. Like dreams that retain emotional weight but lose factual coherence upon examination. The photographs show faces that might be strangers, might be family members, might be products of pareidolia, the mind's tendency to find patterns in random visual static. So what's the truth? I ask. Am I discovering evidence of a conspiracy, or am I having an elaborate mental breakdown in my own basement? The question hangs in the chamber's cold air, unanswered and possibly unanswerable. The battery-powered lanterns continue their strange flickering, creating shadows that suggest movement without revealing its source. The communication system maintains its steady carrier signal, ready to transmit or receive messages from sources that may or may not exist in consensus reality. Truth, Ezra's voice says finally, is what keeps you functional, what allows you to sleep at night, to interact with other people during the day, to maintain the fiction that the world makes sense and that disappeared. People leave explanations behind. I key the radio one final time. Will you still be here tomorrow night at 2:11? The static clears completely, leaving only silence. Then, just before I lose hope of receiving an answer, where else would I be? Some truths are too important to abandon. Some signals are too necessary to stop transmitting. Some nephews need to know that their uncles don't simply vanish without trace. The communication system falls silent, leaving me alone in a chamber that may or may not exist, surrounded by evidence that may or may not prove anything beyond my own need to transform inexplicable loss into explicable mystery. The coordinates on my phone still show my location as 30 feet underground, but the timestamp has advanced to 6:47 a.m. Dawn is breaking above ground, painting the world in shades of gray and rose that seem impossibly distant from this underground reality. I gather what documents I can carry, though I suspect they'll prove unreadable in normal light, illegible outside the context that created them. The tunnel back to my basement stretches longer than it did during my descent, branching into passages I don't remember encountering before. But I follow the main route, guided by symbols that may be carved into stone, or may be products of perception pushed beyond its normal limits. The pendant light in my basement has stopped swaying, its bulb casting steady illumination through the space I left hours ago. The radio upstairs maintains its vigil, scanning frequencies that may or may not carry messages from the spaces between certainty and doubt. I reseal the wall opening, replacing the mortar with careful precision. By tomorrow night at 2:11 a.m., it will be intact again, ready for the next signal, the next journey into the depths beneath rational explanation, ready for the next conversation with truths too important to remain buried, too dangerous to fully excavate. Outside my window, the Maine coast continues its ancient rhythm against the rocks below. The shipyard whistle signals the start of another day shift, calling workers to construct vessels that will carry their crews into waters both known and uncharted. And somewhere in the space between radio static and absolute silence, Ezra waits for the next transmission, the next opportunity to share what the living need to learn about the territories where the disappeared continue their work. The signal will return tonight at 2:11 a.m. It always does.